Great. I think we'll get going on session one. So session one of day two of the conference looks at AI-generated disinformation, actors, motivations, and tactics. This session will examine the increasingly sophisticated landscape of AI and its role in the creation and propagation of disinformation. It will aim to unravel the web of different actors involved in AI-generated disinformation, from state actors to individuals, as well as some of the motivations driving these actors, encompassing different political, economical, and social aims. Topics that we did touch upon yesterday for those that were here, and which hopefully will go into more detail. For this session, we'll have a presentation followed by some time for a Q&A. So without further ado, I'm pleased to say that we are joined by our speaker for this session. Brodie MacDonald is an Associate Fellow at King's College International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation and co-founder of the Oxford Disinformation and Extremism Lab. He previously served as policy advisor to the Government of Canada and was a researcher within the non-partisan Parliamentary Group for Genocide Prevention and Crimes Against Humanity. Prior to this, Brodie was a fellow with the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations and executive editor of the Cambridge International Law Journal. Outside of this, he is a fellow with the Aspen Institute UK and an associate member of Chatham House in London. So Brodie brings with us a wealth of expertise and experience. So without further ado, Brodie, I'm happy to hand the floor to you. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope it's not either too late or too early for you, depending on where you're based. I'm here in Oxford and it's 6 a.m., so bear with me as I get myself into speaking mode. I'm going to start today by going over a couple of examples to really ground the discussion and talk about what we're seeing in my research at King's College London and in Oxford, and to really give you an illustrative example of how this is manifesting online and some of the risks that both you would face as parliamentarians and as policymakers more broadly. So before getting into that, there's a number of different types of malicious actors that are worth mentioning, and they vary both in terms of their sophistication and in their goals. So at the most basic level, we see individuals experimenting with some of these consumer Gen AI tools, image diffusion models, LLMs. This could be for, personal animus if they're directing it towards a political disinformation campaign, or it could be, somebody working on a campaign trying to tarnish their opposition. Outside of that, we have extremist groups, terrorist groups designated as such, which are very quickly experimenting and learning how to use these tools. And indeed, extremists have always been at the sort of forward edge of propaganda, and they will continue to use this in the future to try to shape narratives that serve not just their political violence, but also the broader social context. So we've seen this for many years. The difference now is that they have tools which allow them to basically scale up what they were doing dramatically. And that also applies to the changing nature of extremism, which is increasingly dominated by lone wolf actors, individuals, small cells, in something we call decentralized extremism or post-organizational extremism, which is really characterized by these small cells or these lone wolves. And unfortunately, the use of consumer AI tools favors the individual. It favors the small malicious actor as opposed to a large organization. So when I first started working on this, we would see teams within ISIS and in particular within their media office, which would have vast resources and maybe 20 to 30 people to pump out propaganda. Now, what was once done by 20 or 30 people working in an actual office can be done by one person sitting in a basement somewhere. So as extremism evolves, these tools actually serve the shift in the adversarial landscape that we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years. The other part of it, and the part that frankly concerns me even more, is the role of foreign state actors. State influence campaigns are on the rise, and they're only likely to continue. And these campaigns are going to be even more sophisticated than individuals' use or extremists' use, just in terms of the resources, the IP hiding, and the lack of government crackdown on them. So if a state influence operation in Iran or Russia or North Korea wants to implement these tools, it will go beyond simple experimentation with them. It will be on a industrial scale. And we've seen some examples of this coming out of the Gulf, coming out of Southeast Asia, but I would expect to see much more in the next 2 to 3 years. And there's limited policy options to deal with it at this time, at least. So that's a broad overview of the sort of malicious actors that we see, in addition to, organized crime and issues like that, which I'm less interested in and I focus on less. I want to go through a few examples that I've seen in the last 6 or 8 months, which really highlight this problem. And the first one is very timely. It's in the news. It's, with everything that is happening in Gaza right now, we see incredible amounts of disinformation being pumped out on both sides. And sometimes this is very sophisticated. Other times it's quite simple and basic, but it still does the purpose. It still does the job. If somebody is scrolling through TikTok or Reels or YouTube and, they have 30 seconds for a video, they don't need to scrutinize it, and it doesn't need to be particularly effective or sophisticated. It just needs to convey something very quickly. And that's what we're seeing. Closer to home, the UK, we also saw protests about 2 weeks ago between both sides in London. And interestingly, AI disinformation was used by a far-right group to essentially claim that Sadiq Khan had canceled Remembrance Day. And this actually brought far more people out of the streets and by all accounts contributed to the violence that was seen from the far-right protesters, not from the other side, but the far-right in particular. So we have, countless real-world examples of this, and we're only a couple years now into AI tools really being released to the public. I think it's worth saying that generative AI is not a new phenomena. It's something that has been with us for quite some time in different capacities. I mean, machine learning tools have been used over the last decade for countless different corporate and media uses. So this is not something that is, suddenly, completely new. What is new is sort of consumerization of these tools and the ease and access with which an individual or an extremist group or a state actor can now leverage them directly. And that's where I want to sort of ground all of these examples. The number one issue that we're going to see is really just around the cost and the scale of this content on the one hand, and on the second, the content is becoming much more interactive and much more immersive, which concerns me because what we saw in the last iteration of extremism and disinformation was, content that didn't always hit the mark. It was often quite shoddy and quite rudimentary. But with a lot of these tools, the content is of a professional quality that is actually able to persuade and to change minds. And then when you pair that with the first factor I mentioned, which is just the scale and the cost being dramatically lowered, we have, serious challenges ahead and very slow, limited action on addressing it. So I'll get to some of the responses and interventions in the second part of this, but I want to flag a few quick examples that we've seen from different conflicts and domestic politics right around the world. So as some of you will have seen, there are already countless deepfake videos of Biden, Trump, Zelensky, Putin. Not all of these are particularly convincing, but it's worth pointing out that this technology, in many cases, is 6 months or 12 months old. And some of the more recent ones that I've seen in the last 3 months are actually, light years ahead of what was being put out just last year. This can influence markets. It can influence actual conflicts on the ground. There's many examples in the US where you've seen traders actually make bets on faulty information that was produced by generative AI tools. In various conflicts, you've seen different groups put out statements or deepfake videos trying to discredit or to shock and surprise opponents. So it's very, very easy to see these tools being scaled up in the future, and especially going into 2024, where we have more elections, around the world, and in 70% of the countries, democratic countries, than we usually see. This is something we are far from prepared for. The other part of this that I want to mention is the existing safeguards in place are just not sufficient, if they exist at all. Right. So the first one is just evading the safeguards. I mean, a number of LLMs will put in precautions which would, essentially make it difficult to, let's say, make a manifesto or to produce content with certain keywords or produce images based on certain keywords. But there's a lot of research on this recently. It's incredibly easy to simply change these words. So if you ban, the term crusader, as is often used in some of the extremist and jihadist disinformation we see, they can simply go around and change these words to cover other topics. And so, the existing precautions that we have in place just don't actively stop the production of this content at source. On the flip side, we're facing a double threat because many of the tools that we developed over the last decade to deal with the rise of ISIS and the rise of disinformation in 2016, which rely on hash sharing technology, which essentially, pulls a hash of any extremists or disinformation content and then shares it with other social media providers around the world for free at no cost. Many of these tools will no longer work with some of the generative AI content that we're seeing. Colleague in Amsterdam has a new article out looking at how Gen AI tools can essentially digitize and make each image unique so that hash sharing simply doesn't work. Hash sharing relies on the replication principle, which allows all content to be shared based on a series of shared correlates. But if each piece of extremist content or disinformation content that comes out is edited and obscured, it's simply impossible for the existing tools to capture it and then stop it at source. So there's both an identification problem and a distribution problem that we're increasingly having to grapple with. And as some of these image diffusion models become more and more sophisticated, there's real challenges on how we can build those technical tools to catch up. But it's worth pointing out that we're actually starting from behind now. And this is probably one of the most important things we can do after Provenance and C2PA. I want to focus on specific harms that are applicable to the people on this call. And so one of the most significant ones that we talk about within the field is the spoilers dividend, which is just the very fact that public trust is being severely eroded by the increase in disinformation. So this is just the idea that people increasingly don't know what to believe. And we saw this a little bit during the COVID years, but we've seen it only grow ever since. And I would expect it to get worse. And this erosion of public trust is not just a theoretical issue. It affects everything from health care, what people believe is true and authentic, and where they're taking their advice from, to election polling locations, to statements by politicians. Once we live in a sort of post-truth world where all of these institutions that we used to count on break down, becomes really, really difficult for any average person to know what to believe and what is true. And related to that, there's also something called the liar's dividend, which is actually something that some politicians and far right, far left groups will exploit. So we've seen some examples of this in the US, but I expect to see it elsewhere soon. This is essentially the idea that a politician on the far right or an ideologue on the far left will say something shocking, will incite a riot, or call out a particular minority or ethnic group, and then they will claim that they never did that once they're facing scrutiny for it. So they will essentially claim it's a deep fake, it's AI produced, I never said that, it didn't happen. And again, this feeds into the spoilers dividend as well, which to the average person, nobody knows what to believe, right? You can imagine if AI tools were around when the Access Hollywood tape came out in the US presidential election, and statements like those which were made were denied or blamed on AI. It's a real issue. And in some cases, these could be deepfakes. But in other cases, it's an actual, politician or ideologue saying that, and that's something to be very, very concerned about. As disinformation at the best of times is already, challenging for us to know. So I've got one final thought on this, and then I'm going to turn to interventions and next steps, things that we can do right now. But the most helpful framework that I think all of us should draw on is an academic one that really frames disinformation and, to a lesser extent, extremism as sort of inevitable exhaust or byproduct, the pollution that comes with technological progress and social advances, right? As we see these new technologies, new economies develop, there's tons of potential for growth and for hopefully higher quality work for different people if displacement does not affect it. But at the same time, they come with byproducts like disinformation, like extremism. And the best way that we can deal with that is sort of to contain it, to trap it the same way that we would with exhaust. And I think it's useful to remember this when we think about disinformation. It's not something, that we're ever going to stop fully, but it's something that we can limit and we can contain. And that really comes through the series of interventions, which I'll mention now. So there's two sides to this. One is the developer side, and the other is the distribution side. On the developer side, I believe yesterday you spoke about C2PA and the need for provenance. This is really big, and it's not just for companies. Or media organizations. I would argue that this is something that any parliamentarian or any politician should also take to heart and implement on their teams. So the basic idea of provenance or C2PA is to essentially develop a blockchain tool that provides context on how each image has been created and manipulated right from the place of origin. And there's a number of different startups and companies working on this right now. Some of them led by large industry leaders like Adobe and Microsoft, and others of them much smaller. But the C2PA, the Coalition for Provenance and Authenticity, is doing important work, and that should be absolutely supported. But on the regulatory and risk side, it's worth pointing out that I see the bigger threat coming not from the large players like Adobe or Microsoft or Meta or others, right now. But what I see is smaller startups and smaller companies who are developing AI tools or developing image diffusion models, or increasingly spin-offs of them. So they'll take an LLM from an established player and then develop further tools from it. These are the applications where I see the biggest risks, because these small companies, medium-sized companies, and even startups do not have the resources or the knowledge to hire trust and safety teams, to hire ethicists, to think through some of the problematic uses of their technologies. And so if you want to focus regulation, it should focus on providing support for these small players, not the enterprise and industry leaders, which already have quite robust teams in place. On the distribution side of it, it's also worth mentioning, it's great if you try to stop this at source, but ultimately, when it's shared virally, when it's shared at scale, that's where the real threat comes from. And within that, it's not oftentimes the mainstream platforms where we're seeing the biggest issues. It's actually the alt tech platforms, the Gabs, the Truth Socials of the world, where the real risks lie. That's not to say that this can't seep onto mainstream platforms, and indeed it has. But right now we see the biggest use of this on Gab and Truth Social, a few other small ones like Rocket Chat. And then there's also the special case of Telegram. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but Telegram is widely used outside of North America and Europe. And it is a very strange platform. Only about 50 employees scattered all around the world, despite having 500 million users, and famously lacks for their content moderation policies. I've personally seen deepfakes, edited videos of politicians on there, and there's absolutely no action taken by the organization. And so further regulation on these sort of outliers, you can't really call Telegram an alt tech platform anymore with 500 million users, but it's one of the largest social media platforms in the world. But it currently lies outside of existing regulation. And it's something that is one of the most important issues to address, both for disinformation and extremism. Related to the regulatory side, I want to mention the Online Safety Bill, which passed here in the UK, and I know there's a number of other pieces of legislation around the Commonwealth that aim to do similar things. It's worth pointing out that the Online Safety Bill has a lot of good measures in it, but it also has some bad ones as well. And broadly, the point I want to emphasize is that the solution to disinformation is not to limit free speech. So the Online Safety Bill included a number of measures that would have initially tried to ban end-to-end encryption, which is relied on by political dissidents in Iran and elsewhere, as well as just ordinary families to communicate, and businesses. And so we have to be careful when we calibrate the regulatory response, not to go so far that we actually destroy free expression, free speech, which are, after all, the bedrock of what we're trying to protect in the first place. So if we pass legislation that threatens free speech and free expression, we're actually giving up before we've even started. This is something that I know is controversial and contentious, and we're going to see more and more debates over this as similar pieces of legislation pass. But it's really important to mention that this is not the way forward. And indeed, if intelligence agencies and public security agencies have missed all of the other tells that come without banning end-to-end encryption or putting backdoors into end-to-end encryption, then we're in a much more serious place. And there's other ways to detect this content without using it. The other practical piece of advice and guidance I wanted to flag was training for your campaign teams, your special advisors or political advisors, and especially constituency assistants. As a former political advisor, I know that these folks, particularly constituency assistants, are on the receiving end of a lot of this, and they will see it first and foremost. So please provide them the training that they need to have to understand what a deepfake is and to understand what provenance is and how they can actually safeguard a lot of the content that will be put out, both about you themselves and the party, the office, all the rest of it. And as part of that, I should say, embracing provenance and C2PA is a very, very good way to get ahead of this. So, large media organizations like the BBC have already done this. There are free applications. There are companies that will collaborate with public officials like yourselves. There are many different ways to get ahead of this. And the last piece that I want to mention, I know I'm running out of time here, but the last piece is really support for public-private partnerships like the GIFCT, Tech Against Terrorism, and the Coalition for Provenance and Authenticity. The solutions to the previous Web 2.0 wave that we saw came out of these public-private partnerships. This is where the hash sharing technology that we spoke about was developed. This is where support for small startups and small companies came from. And so that is really, if you want to target responses to get the most return, that is really where we can have the most impact. I think I will leave it there, but I look forward to the Q&A, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Brodie. A very, very insightful presentation, lots to unpack. I'll try and give a brief synopsis, but I think it was good to start by going over the different actors involved. We touched upon a bit this yesterday. I think we're particularly with some case studies in relation to elections, but I think touching on the different state and non-state actors. And I particularly liked how you attach the evolving nature and methods of disinformation in relation to terrorism linked to the evolving nature of terrorism itself. And I think that was something we touched upon yesterday about the precedence of disinformation and different historical analogies that the enduring changing nature of geopolitics and the global landscape will be inextricably linked to the changing nature of disinformation as well. I think some of the different challenges you mentioned, the cost and scale, the increasing sophistication of disinformation, but I think on the flip side, being the enduring use of just cheap and easy, essentially, disinformation is still very, very effective as well. And again, I think ending it well on the different interventions. We have a session later on today, specifically on provenance, and we'll look at the C2PA process as well. So I think that will be an interesting discussion to flow from this, and also on the regulation. And I think ending it with some quite bespoke and individual solutions, particularly for our interested stakeholders, so for members of Parliament and what they can do and their teams can do to combat disinformation. So that brings us, we do have about 5-10 minutes for Q&A. So I'd encourage attendees to put your comments in the chats or the Q&A functions. We've got the two functions in Zoom to pose questions. We've got a few coming in now, which we'll try and manage. I think maybe, Brodie, I'll start with one or two myself and some that I've collected that I think that we got yesterday that I think we can bring in today. On that point of, I think the different sides of the growing professionalism, scale and cost and sophistication of disinformation, the different actors that are using it, but also the enduring use of more, I guess, traditional means of disinformation, for lack of a better word. And I think you used the example of Gaza and how this more cheap and easy to distribute disinformation, maybe human-made disinformation, is still extremely potent and effective. I guess my question would be, where are we at then in the development of AI-generated disinformation and its use by different actors, state and non-state? Are we at a mature level, or do you think we're still very much at an early level where maybe more traditional means of disinformation are maybe more effective and we're just at an early stage? Or do you think we are reaching a level of maturity where this AI-generated disinformation is now being seen as a primary tool for those actors, those nefarious actors that are involved in it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll give an example in a minute of something I saw 2 weeks ago, but I think the answer really depends on the actor involved. So we see quite advanced and sort of sophisticated use of disinformation of AI tools in disinformation when it comes to foreign state governments, simply because they have the resources to actually establish quite a robust operation, and then cascades down from there in terms of quality. And particularly with extremist groups, we see, I would say, experimental use of AI at this point. We don't see widespread adoption yet, although things move so quickly in this field that even 6 months later, I see a lot more. There's a number of groups in Pakistan that are using AI generated images to accompany what were previously quite boring audio recordings that they would send out to their followers. And I mean, these videos actually make the content much more engaging and much more interesting to somebody watching it. The other piece of it that is worth pointing out is contextual translation tools are growing rapidly and are getting quite sophisticated. So the same group in Pakistan that's putting out this content is now able to translate the messages into 140 languages, and it's actually quite accurate, quite moving, not just like a Google Translate, and it's being translated in real time with the video, with the images. So I think it's quite interesting to see different AI tools being layered on top of each other to really expand the reach and to make the content much more engaging. And then, you have individuals experimenting with this as well. There was a case of a sort of malicious actor who put out supposed photographs of Palestinians, partying up around the world while the conflict went on. It was quite quickly shut down on Twitter and Telegram because people took one look at it and they could see, well, the face doesn't quite actually match the image of the person on the private jet. And so there is a good community of people who will tackle this content when it's not sophisticated. But I think sadly we're in the sort of last throes of seeing content that is easily identifiable, just without looking at the provenance of it. I think even in the last 6 months, the leaps have been so significant that when we look a year or 2 years out, I really worry that the sort of amateurish, unsophisticated nature of some of the previous content we saw by individuals will just evaporate, and individual tools will be just as powerful as those used by state actors.
Thank you, Brody. We've had several questions come in. I've been trying to decipher some of these questions myself. Obviously, it's quite a technical nature, but I think some of these can be grouped together in terms of some of the technical and more specific solutions to combat or reduce disinformation. So one of these questions is specifically on is there and what open source tools are available to detect deep fakes, videos and images. And then I think the other questions relate to perhaps some of the algorithms that can pass thresholds for which content or videos that could impact them being shared or distributed or impacting their visibility. And then again, the third one I think links to that in trying to find methods to reduce the sharing and distribution of these things, rather than the other side of trying to debunk them and methods to counter them in that sense. So hopefully those could be answered semi together. Yeah.
I'll group them together a little bit and talk about the technical side of this. So it's worth actually going back to the previous iteration of extremist content and disinformation content that we saw. Really, the first time when organizations were forced to grapple with this was with the rise of the Islamic State in the early 2010s. And many platforms were exploited by this group and other groups like it for a number of years. And there's a recognition that we had to develop technical solutions to identify this content right at the source and then remove it immediately. And other examples like the Christchurch call also point to the far right threat as well. We need tools that are both nimble and effective immediately, so that if somebody is live streaming some horrific act, can be detected, but also if content is being put out simultaneously across 5 different platforms, we can detect it at source and remove it. The solution to that was really something called hash sharing, and there's a number of different platforms like the TCAP system that do this. I mean, others like Google have worked on a sort of freemium option that's available to small companies, not individuals, but small companies and startups. But these technologies at their core rely on taking a digital hash of a piece of disinformation and then sending it around to all the other members in the network, and really showing them before the content reaches their networks what it looks like, so that it can be automated and removed at the point that it's uploaded. So if you try to upload a piece of disinformation that's been hashed to a prominent social media platform, you won't even make it past the upload phase, or it'll be there for 30 seconds before taken down. So these tools were actually incredibly effective. There was loopholes, there was evasion tactics that I've written about previously. People would again tweak things and modify things, but by and large, they were capturing a lot of this content at scale. Now the threat has changed. I mean, we talk a lot about adversarial shift, and this is something, it's a never-ending game of cat and mouse where you close one loophole and they open up another. But generative AI tools actually, I think, are a bit beyond just a simple loophole. This is a sea change in terms of how this content is produced and what we can do about it. So in the past, I would have to manually edit a photo if I wanted to evade hash sharing tools, right? So that would be literally going into some photo editing software and changing, putting a watermark on it, putting lines across it, obscuring it, changing the filters to make it substantially different, such that hash sharing would not pick up on these tools. As we see now, I mean, it's incredible. I can take one image, put it in an image diffusion model, and ask for 100 different, slightly different varieties of the same image, and then share those immediately and essentially get past a lot of the hash sharing technologies. Now, it depends, how detailed and how sophisticated these efforts are, but the initial examples that I've seen are, it's very easy for individuals to sufficiently modify images such that they can evade detection. And then on top of that, somebody had an interesting piece about this, where you can actually ask AI tools to develop new methods to evade content. So we've seen some pieces of disinformation and extremist content which actually use optical illusions and sort of try to hide the message of whatever is being put in there, such that it even takes a human a minute to understand what it is. And so it's very unlikely that machine learning tools are going to detect that content right at source. So that's a sort of background and history of content moderation more broadly. I should say there's great teams working on this, and I know Ofcom is also very engaged in it, and other regulators in different Commonwealth countries who are engaged on it. But it is a real threat, and any new efforts that we are working on now, there's a question of whether they'll be ready in time for 2024. There's a question of how field tested will they be when we start to see new advances. And then lastly, it's incredibly easy to close one loophole and then have another one open up right after it. So we need a really dynamic and nimble approach that is not just regulatory or technical or legal, but all three.
Brilliant. Thanks, Brody. I think that brings us to time. And I think that ends on a good note, really. We had some more questions that came in yesterday as well. And I think a lot of those centered around who has the responsibility for combating AI. And I think ultimately it's a shared responsibility. You've mentioned many of the different solutions that private companies, social media companies, startups, large organizations are engaged in. But also, what governments are doing and the role of regulation essentially as well, and the different processes that are going on around provenance, which will lead us very well into the next 3 sessions, which is on the role of parliamentarians, specifically the role of provenance and the role of AI governance. So I think ultimately it's a shared responsibility, and I think it's finding where the balance lies within that responsibility. So I think that's a very good way to end that session on. I think I can speak on behalf of myself and all the attendees in thanking you, Brody, for an excellent presentation and some really articulate answers there to some of the questions from our attendees. So a big thank you again. Thank you. And we will now move very swiftly on to our next session, which is on the role of parliamentarians and what the institution of Parliament is doing to combat disinformation and AI-generated disinformation. So with that, thank you, Brody, and I'm happy to hand back to my colleague James, who will introduce the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack, and thanks to Brody for his very high-level and expert insights on some of the actors and tactics and motivations behind disinformation. I think that got, as you say, a lot of questions in and also a lot of thoughts going through attendees' minds. As Jack says, we're now moving on to our session on the role of Parliament and parliamentarians. We're very pleased to have received some pre-recorded remarks from the Honourable Mark Mendicino. The Honourable Mark Mendicino was first elected as the Member of Parliament for Eglinton Lawrence in 2015 in Ontario, Canada. Between 2019 and 2023, he first served as Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, and subsequently as Minister of Public Safety. Whilst in Cabinet, MP Mendicino led Canada's economic and humanitarian migration policy, introduced legislation to modernise the national cybersecurity infrastructure, and strengthened the federal government's approach to combating foreign interference. MP Mendicino has also chaired the Five Eyes Ministerial Conference in New Zealand, where allied efforts to combat foreign interference and protect democracies were strengthened. Before being elected, MP Mendicino served as a federal prosecutor for a decade, prosecuting high-profile cases of national security. He also worked at the Law Society of Ontario, served as president of the Association of Justice Council, and was an adjunct professor at Osgoode Hall Law School. It's still early in the morning, so it's hard to say some of these. As I say, Honourable Mendicino was very kind in providing pre-recorded remarks, as we want contributions from high-level speakers right around the Commonwealth, right around the world. That does mean that some can't join us live, but nonetheless, we are very pleased to receive these pre-recorded remarks.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association for inviting me to contribute to this conference. Greetings from Canada and our nation's capital in Ottawa, where yes, we've already had our first snow. And yes, when the world thinks about Canada, the images that most often come to mind is that of the giant red maple leaf, hockey, and perhaps Justin Bieber. However, Canada is also one of the original birthplaces of AI. As many of you will know, we are home to the great pioneers, Professors Hinton and Bengio, both of whom are extraordinary technologists, thinkers, and navigators in this new age. I want to commend the CPA for choosing artificial intelligence, disinformation, parliament, and digital democracy as the main theme for this year's conference. It could not be more timely. Indeed, time is of the essence. The blazing speed at which AI is evolving is profoundly impacting democracies around the world. We are at the dawn of a new and unprecedented era of digital democracy. The obvious question we must confront now is, how will generative AI impact this existing landscape and shape democracy in the future? Since the release of ChatGPT in November 2022, AI has captured global attention and gained much steam in the market. Analysts estimate that by 2030, AI will add over $4 trillion to the global economy annually. With that level of investment, the promise of AI is wondrous, solving climate change, curing cancer, preventing the next pandemic, creating new economies that might eradicate hunger and poverty once and for all. AI makes the previously unimaginable imaginable and puts these goals within our grasp. Likewise, AI has vast potential to sway the political process. Voters are already using ChatGPT to compare their local candidates' positions on issues and to inform their choice on the ballot. Political leaders are beginning to use AI to allow their likeness and voice to interact multilingually with their constituents in real time, as we saw New York City Mayor Eric Adams do very recently. More creatively, it's easy to foresee a political party using generative AI to transpose campaign platforms to augmented reality so a voter could get the look and feel of an entirely new city in a yet-to-be-developed part of the country. On the security side, law enforcement could deploy AI to analyze intelligence to prevent a cyber attack on Election Day. There are many positive applications that will help to protect democratic institutions and enhance voter rights. On the other hand, if misaligned, AI can distort and deconstruct the foundations on which democracies are grounded. And we've already seen it. Deepfakes are being weaponized as purveyors of disinformation, making it practically impossible to distinguish what's real from simulation. Just about a month ago, an audio of Keir Starmer, the leader of the official opposition in the UK, was leaked wherein he's heard verbally abusing a staffer, laced with profanity. It took less than 24 hours to debunk this deepfake. But the only problem was that that audio had been downloaded more than 1 million times inside that day. The damage had been done. Now, as a citizen, when you can't be sure who or what to trust, or what the rules of the game are, and that they're not being rigged, confidence erodes. People lose faith. Our democracies weaken. A UNESCO report recently on elections in the digital era identified 3 threats to elections. 1, the spread of malmis and disinformation. 2, a corresponding increase in hate speech, intimidation, and violence towards elected public figures, particularly women and racialized individuals, as well as journalists. And 3, interference that could undermine the integrity of the electoral process. The challenge before us is to mitigate these risks while leveraging the beneficial aspects of AI. The objective is to strengthen political rights, processes, and ultimately the institutions that form the foundation of democracy. So how can we achieve this? Well, for starters, it's up to us legislators to do a better job in keeping pace with AI. Governments can overcome this Herculean task by strengthening collaboration with developers, consulting more robustly with the public, and developing new laws and policies that will provide a proper frame for the use of AI. It is on this last point, on legislative and policy reform, that I have chosen to focus my remarks. My offering is about creating a new paradigm, a paradigm that is based on a set of generally accepted principles in relation to AI that have been distilled from existing statutes and policies. A paradigm that can be applied to elections, campaigns, and other democratic institutions. A paradigm that is alive to the risks that AI poses and at the same time marshals its raw technological capability for good. To elaborate, I've organized my remarks into 3 parts. First, where are we now? In which I will offer a quick overview on the state of democracy and a summary of the proposed generally accepted AI principles, or what I'll call GAPE. Second, where do we need to go? We'll take GAPE and apply it to the electoral process. Here, we'll do a bit of a deeper dive into how we should apply GAPE to democratic elections and political campaigns, and focus on a few near-term practical issues that need addressing. And third, what is the road ahead? And I'll conclude by highlighting 3 broad recommendations that will hopefully serve as a call to action to align the modernization of our democratic institutions as the evolution of AI forges ahead. So first, where are we? Much work has already been done to establish governance models for artificial intelligence. For efficiency's sake, I'll provide a short overview of the recurring principles that have emerged within those existing models of governance. These are principles, as I said, that I'll refer to as GAPE. But before we get into GAPE, I do think it's valuable to do a quick take stock of democracy's standing in the world. After 2 centuries of robust growth, the number of democracies is actually decreasing in the last 10 years. Experts differ on the percentages, but there's a consensus that the total number of people living outside of democracies is actually growing. The number of people living in liberal democracies fell from 1.2 billion in 2012 to about 1 billion in 2022. One reason why democracy may be backsliding is that citizens doubt by a wide margin whether they can actually influence democratic institutions that are there to serve them. According to a 2022 Pew Research study, 19 countries surveyed said that they either felt that they did not have any or much influence on their political systems by a wide margin of more than 2 to 1. So will AI close or grow that gap of public confidence in future elections? And to answer that question, the logical starting point for me is to examine the principles that have begun to coalesce around AI governance. For my research, I canvassed domestic and international legislative frameworks from around the world. I'll highlight here Canada's cornerstone legislation on this subject is the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, or AIDA. And in September, we introduced a voluntary code of conduct that was there to guide businesses' use of AI. The code of conduct is intended to apply to advanced generative systems, specific actors referred to as developers and managers, and provides details on how to measure outcomes that are aligned to good purpose on AI. Canada's approach tracks other international policies in this space, including the G7 Hiroshima process on generative AI, the G20 declaration, the EU proposed legislation on AI, the global partnership on AI, and the ethical principles related to AI voluntarily implemented by some of the largest industry leaders in this space. From a mile up, I believe we can distill these instruments into the following 7 generally accepted principles: safety, transparency, accountability, privacy, equity, openness and digital literacy, and finally, responsibility and the public good. Now, this GAPE list is not intended to be exhaustive, nor should these principles in their application operate independently as silos. Rather, gaps should be interpreted flexibly, where principles are interconnected and aligned to their overarching purpose, namely to promote the safe, responsible, and innovative development of AI in a manner that is consistent with the public good. So where do we need to go? In this section, I will expand on GAPE and then apply each principle to the context of the democratic process, focusing on elections. So let's start with safety. Safety must be paramount in the creation of AI. There are dual components to the principle of safety. There is the safety that we as consumers expect developers and innovators to build into AI. And then there is the safety that we as citizens expect our governments to ensure from potential threats to our national and domestic security that could be caused by AI. For developers, safety is achieved when AI is reliable, predictable, and produces a desired outcome that causes no harm to individual or public security. Future-proofing AI systems is critical, which is why safety needs to contemplate the possibility of misalignment of AI, as Professor Bengio from Canada and others have opined. Safety requires proactive, vigilant, and rigorous risk assessment. There's already a strong consensus that AI should be prohibited for certain purposes, including for the development of nuclear, biochemical, and other weapons capable of creating mass devastation. These are the obvious examples. There are others. Should there be an absolute prohibition in the use of AI in the political context, specifically in campaigns and elections? This seems impracticable and unenforceable. A total ban may even be counterproductive given that AI will have beneficial applications, as we've already discussed. The more pressing question is what safety parameters are needed to promote the legitimate use of generative AI systems during political campaigns. So let's start with a reasonable hypothetical. Would it be appropriate for a candidate to produce an ad using the likeness of an opponent, which uses AI to depict them violating the law. I posit such a use would be highly inappropriate and, in fact, should be unlawful and prosecutable. We'll explore the need for legislative reform further under the principle of transparency. But let me turn briefly to the government's responsibilities when it uses AI to promote public safety. It's not a stretch to see how government could deploy AI to facilitate facial recognition, intelligence analyses, and surveillance to secure public safety. In each instance, governments should adhere to three fundamental principles when using AI to preserve public safety. First, that there is a law or policy that authorizes the use of AI. Second, that the law authorizing AI balances individual human rights, including the right to privacy. And third, that the way AI is legally deployed by the state itself is itself reasonable. When there are concerns about the state action in question, the courts and judicial oversight will have an important role to play in this paradigm as an independent guarantor of our democratic values. One last note on safety from the government perspective. There are existing international mechanisms already in place and designed to mitigate against the threat of disinformation, whose mandates could be expanded to include elections. Two examples that come readily to my mind are the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism and the OECD's Global Incidents Monitor process. Both could be leveraged to coordinate real-time AI analysis on risks during elections, including where there may be foreign interference. Where the concerns are serious enough, critical incident reporting protocols could be triggered to inform the public. Together, the steps will promote the lawful and responsible use of AI to protect public safety. Now let's turn to transparency. The need for AI transparency in the political process is essential. Transparency is integral to trust. Voters assess candidates on a wide variety of factors, including authenticity, openness, accessibility, values, among other intangible qualities. For this reason, political campaigns are necessarily held to a higher standard of ethics. Current elections laws in most democracies, including in Canada, require disclosure related to sources of funding, assets, and other political activities which contribute to the campaign. If abused, AI could frustrate transparency in the democratic process. The better generative AI becomes at creating images that look, sound, and even feel like authentic human beings, the harder it becomes for voters to tell the difference, making it possible to circumvent the goals of transparency. In my view, as the bar for AI technology gets higher, so too should the bar for transparency increase in equal and proportionate measure. In the modern era of digital campaigns, transparency requires being open about data, algorithms, automated decision-making, and outputs generated by AI in a way that can be clearly understood. To extrapolate, I'll focus on one concrete example which requires a near-term solution because of impending elections in jurisdictions where AI is already being deployed. The proliferation of online deepfakes is a pressing and substantial challenge right now, as I mentioned earlier regarding the fabricated audio from a leader of the official opposition in the UK. So what can we do about it? In the first place, there's an urgent need to consider strengthening legislation. In Canada, the Chief Electoral Officer recommended that a new offense be created for knowingly making false statements about the voting process with the intention of disrupting an election or to undermine its results. This would address a current gap in the law. But in my view, we need to go further. Legislation might also stipulate that candidates, parties, and actors within a campaign should have to publicly disclose whenever they use Gen AI for communications. Tools already exist on this front. Developers have launched various software which can embed digital protocols, or what we sometimes refer to as earmarks, directly into the pixels of an image to verify authenticity. Clear notification to the voter should be the standard. But what about non-legitimate uses of Gen AI for political advertising? Restrictions up to and including prohibition should be contemplated for any party who uses Gen AI to depict an opponent breaking the law or committing a violent act. Of course, rigorous free speech, especially during an election, must be a heavy counterweight to regulatory overreach. There will be cases that fall into a gray zone, such as when Gen AI is used by one party to paint an opponent in an unsavory light. As we untangle these knots, balancing the integrity of the electoral process and privacy interests will help to inform where to draw the line. Drawing it in the right place will be more of an art than an exact science. While I will not elaborate on them now, we should also discuss higher standards for transparency being arguably needed when it comes to voter targeting and algorithms as well. Now, let's turn to accountability. Accountability as a principle requires holding individuals, businesses, governments, and other entities responsible for the development and the uses of AI technologies. This principle underscores that developers and deployers have a responsibility to mitigate the risks that AI systems pose and to be prepared to identify, explain, and remedy potentially harmful outcomes. In elections, human oversight is critical. It's essential to satisfy the principle of accountability. For example, while AI may be deployed to strengthen voters' rights and the efficiency of voting procedures, humans must always and ultimately retain the right to oversee compliance with the rules and the final vote, most especially where there are tight elections and recounts. In a similar vein, I'd be remiss if I did not mention a growing chorus of the cautionary notes that are being sounded by many tech leaders to meter the release of large language and frontier models that are more powerful than ChatGPT-4. These exhortations from some developers can and should apply accountability to themselves as a safeguarding principle, even when it may hinder competition in the short run. This trade-off will help to promote responsible AI in the long run. Now let's talk about privacy. Privacy refers to an individual's rights regarding their personal information and how it is collected, processed, and shared by AI. Privacy requires upholding the confidentiality and security of user data, and that AI applications do not breach an individual's privacy rights. Waivers of privacy or opt-outs should be clearly understood, informed, and revocable. Privacy may also require express consent and data anonymization when your personal information is shared with third parties. Although privacy exists as a fundamental statutory right in most democracies and a constitutional right in several, exercising it is complex. The individual's dilemma as a consumer is either to click "I agree" unconditionally on a platform's terms or to be left out of the market. And when was the last time any of you, or anyone for that matter, actually read all of the fine print before clicking "I agree"? You see my point. In Canada, the Privacy Commissioner's submissions on the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act recently made the following recommendations. Strengthen language to expressly recognize privacy as a fundamental right in the context of AI. Require privacy impact statements on organizations who use high-risk generative AI. Allow individuals to use authorized representatives to exercise those privacy rights. And finally, to ensure that there is flexible and fast dispute resolution over voluntary compliance agreements. Privacy raises important questions about how AI data-driven personalization, surveillance, and analytics may be used to influence individual behavior, including voter preferences. Respecting individual privacy can strengthen trust, but it will require ongoing significant reforms along the lines that I've just mentioned. Let's talk about equity. Equity requires that AI systems be developed in a way that is fair and consistent with human rights and reduces systemic barriers to minority groups that have been historically underrepresented and left on the margins of our institutions and communities. This means AI should be developed and trained to understand existing biases and mitigate them. Let me say unequivocally, the AI sector should provide equal opportunities and treatment to all individuals regardless of their demographic characteristics, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, or other immutable characteristics. The goal of equity in AI is to promote inclusivity and to reduce disparity of opportunity. In elections, it will be vital to ensure equity is respected in all areas of the political process, including to prevent the malicious use of AI to impede accessibility or to suppress the vote. Let me turn to openness and digital literacy. Openness refers to democratizing AI and involves sharing information about the design, functionality, and operation of AI technologies to ensure accountability, understanding, and scrutiny. The principle of openness is important for building trust, fostering collaboration, and preventing the concentration of AI power in the hands of a few. In the context of elections, openness is also necessary to promote digital literacy. As we've discussed, Mis and disinformation threats are threats to democracy which could be amplified by AI. To understand how to mitigate these risks, we need to assess the extent of the problem. A recent YouGov survey measured America's susceptibility to false headlines, or what we refer to commonly as fake news. In the aggregate, 36% of those polled received a low score. 10 headlines or more as understood as correct. Alarmingly, only 11% of 18 to 29-year-old demographics got a high score where they saw over 16 headlines as being correct. The survey found that generally, the longer someone spends time recreationally online, the greater their susceptibility to misinformation. To reverse these trends, we need to dramatically increase public education campaigns to help voters understand how AI is used in the elections, what is legitimate, what is not, and where are the safeguards that are in place. Digital literacy, even more than coding, needs to be fully integrated into primary and secondary schooling and beyond. And citizens of all ages need to hone critical reasoning more than any other skill set to be equipped to deal with disinformation and to be able to understand how to separate fact from fiction. Let me turn to the last principle of responsibility in the public good. This principle is all about implicating a broad set of ethical questions related to AI. The public good is the principle that AI technologies should be developed and used in ways that benefit social goods as a whole. That AI should be socially beneficial is similar to the democratic principle of responsible government, which states that representation is legitimized through majority consensus. Responsible AI will promote addressing global challenges related to the environment, healthcare, poverty, education, accessibility, and sustainability. It emphasizes the importance of balancing innovation with the broader welfare of society. Responsibility works in lockstep with other principles, including transparency, accountability, and adherence to ethical guidelines to avoid harm, bias, and misuse of AI systems. So, what is the road ahead? Having applied GAPE to the political process, what does the road ahead look like? Well, I've already endorsed concrete suggestions that would create a new offense for fraudulent misrepresentation using AI during an election, greater disclosure obligations in the use of AI for campaign-related activities, and the proposal of creating an international network to combat mis and disinformation during elections, which could leverage AI. Layered on top of these, I offer three broad recommendations. One, we need an international convention to establish GAPE that will set universal global standards for AI. This is a lofty goal, but it's achievable. The UK recently hosted an AI safety summit, which brought together like-minded countries who agreed to a plan and a role for government in safety testing of frontier AI models. We need to broaden the global conversations so that we can achieve a consensus on the new rules of the road for responsible AI. I believe the GAPE paradigm is a good starting point for this international consensus. We need to apply GAPE specifically to democratic institutions and elections. This is urgent. There are many elections coming in the next 12 to 18 months, including for many Commonwealth countries. This means conducting a comprehensive gap analysis to a political set of activities and voter rights that could be impacted by AI. I've offered some ideas, but there is more work to be done, in particular the training of various branches of democracy, including elected parliamentarians, independent public servants, and various agencies. That's the second recommendation, which takes me to the third and final. The international community and industry leaders need to set concrete timelines. The AI train has left the station, and it isn't going to wait for democracy or anything else to modernize itself. We have to act with urgency, resolve, and solidarity. In conclusion, humanity has survived and even thrived after technological revolutions in the past. But what differentiates AI in this moment? Not only its scale and speed, but the near human outcomes it produces, which blur the lines between authenticity and simulation in ways that we could not previously imagine. As generative AI systems become more and more human-like, we must ask ourselves a number of fundamental questions. Should we permit the unregulated use of AI, limit it, or ban it altogether when it comes to elections and the political process? Or does it make more sense to come up with a frame that will work? How does AI understand truth? Can it understand truth? Can we code AI to understand democratic values? And will AI move too quickly for democracy, or will it evolve and strengthen human connection and agency in our democratic institutions? Human interaction is the sine qua non of democracy. Without human debate, disputes, and compromise, democracy becomes something else. For all its potential to replicate human-like productivity, AI, for now at least, remains a simulator, a tool, and it therefore cannot be a complete and total substitute for human agency within a democracy. But we can't take democracy in perpetuity for granted. Therefore, it's incumbent on us to ensure that we meet this technological revolution with the same courage and resolve that humanity has in the past. Thank you very much again to the CPA for the invitation, and I wish you all a very, very good conference.
So enormous thanks once again to the Honourable Marco Mendocino for sharing those comments on the role of parliamentarians, the role of parliaments, the role of democratic institutions more widely, and also for covering the generally acceptable principles of ethical and responsible AI. Honourable Mendocino touched upon the safety, transparency, accountability, privacy, equity, openness and digital literacy, and responsibility and public good around AI. And I think some really interesting philosophical questions at the end there about whether AI can understand truth and democratic norms. So very thought-provoking contributions there from the Honourable Mendocino. Yesterday, we allowed for attendees to have 5 minutes of standing up, leaving the desk. I'm conscious we've held your attention now for about an hour and 20 minutes, or a little under an hour and 20 minutes. We do have another pre-recorded segment, which is 45 minutes. So I just want to give 5 minutes pause for all attendees to just rest their eyes, rest their minds a little bit, and we'll reconvene in 5 minutes. Please do stay online. Please don't leave the call. The next session is all about provenance, which has been discussed today, was discussed quite a lot yesterday. We've heard about C2PA. We're actually going to hear from two of the leading individuals working on C2PA, working on provenance. A lot of people want to know about specific tools that combats disinformation and AI generated disinformation, synthetic media. This really, really speaks to those concerns in a very, very direct way. So please do stay online, make sure you're still with us in the next 5 minutes. But with that, if I could just ask a colleague maybe to just share a holding screen for now, and we'll reconvene, as I say, in 5 minutes.
Without further ado, a very warm welcome to this session on mitigating AI-generated disinformation and the role of provenance. I think this is a session which, out of all the sessions we have at this conference, might need the most explanation, including what we mean by provenance. Attempts to combat and mitigate synthetic disinformation are multi-layered and have more recently become embedded in larger processes to regulate artificial intelligence. Spanning international processes, national regulations, industry initiatives, and platform-specific actions, they vary widely, but coalesce around addressing these issues of dis and misinformation, whilst also preserving democratic values and human rights. Attendees during the first day of this conference will have learned about the core concepts of disinformation, artificial intelligence, and synthetic media, and they will have developed earlier today a greater understanding of the actors, motivations, and tactics behind AI-generated disinformation. This session will look to reassure attendees that there are innovative initiatives to combat the potentially subversive nature of AI-generated disinformation and synthetic media, including during elections and other periods of political sensitivity, like some of the conflicts that we are currently seeing around the world. We're delighted to be joined by two high-level experts who not only have extensive knowledge of the role of provenance in combating disinformation, but who have been directly involved in efforts to actually mitigate AI-generated disinformation. I think I'll invite both experts to provide a short introduction to themselves. I know they're going to be super contributors to our conference. And Andy, maybe we'll start with yourself.
Thanks so much. It's a delight to be here and have this conversation with you and Bruce today. I'm Andy Parsons. I'm a Senior Director of Engineering at Adobe, where I run our Content Authenticity Initiative, which we started just about 4 years ago this week. And in that role, I oversee all of our provenance efforts. I know we'll get into the definition of provenance shortly. And that sort of breaks down into 3 areas. One, we put these tools to work in Adobe, in the Creative Cloud, in the Experience Cloud products that we have. Second, we have a big commitment to open source to make sure that these techniques for content provenance and disinformation countermeasures are available to anybody who wants to implement them. And third, where I work very closely with Bruce every week, we have a standards effort that's a broad collaborative thing called the C2PA, Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, where I represent Adobe on the steering committee.
Thanks so much, Andy. And Bruce.
Hi, welcome. Thanks. I'm Bruce McCormick. I chair something called Project Origin, which is an effort we put together about 4 years ago as well, with the CBC Radio Canada, the public broadcaster in Canada, the BBC, the New York Times, and Microsoft. And we, at the time, started taking a look at what the nature of disinformation was with deepfakes and methods that could combat them, and came to the conclusion that provenance was pretty well the best bet in the hand of technologies that we saw out there. And as users of the technology, said we need to make sure our requirements are clearly known. And that's when we started working with Adobe and Andy and Microsoft and the C2PA to say, okay, as users, let's express what our needs are. Let the technology companies describe how best to fulfill those needs, and then see if we can bring out a universal solution. Provenance is going to work, but it takes some time to put together because you got to get everybody aligned. And as you've heard, we've been working at this for about 4 years trying to build alignment. And luckily, I think we've got some real traction right now.
Great, thank you so much, both. Yeah, as I said in the introduction, maybe we can start by just unpacking what we mean when we look at the role of provenance, and what do we really mean by provenance in the context of AI-generated content. And maybe, Andy, if we could come to you first.
Sure, thanks for the opportunity to define this. It's a term that Bruce and I and many in our community take for granted at this point, but it still needs definition. In fact, there are parties like the Partnership on AI who are, building taxonomies around the language we use around disinformation countermeasures, especially when it comes to data. So the broad idea is, we imagine that you could have something like a nutrition label for content. In the C2PA parlance, we call that content credentials. So a content credential you can think of as a nutrition label that tells you what a piece of content is. It stops well short by design of making judgment calls about whether that content is trustworthy. It's up to the viewer of that content, the receiver, the fact checker, the end consumer on social media, to field a set of trust signals, as we call them, and make up their own mind. We think that this provenance idea belongs in the hands of consumers and fact checkers and others to make up their own minds about whether something is trustworthy. Trust signals can be details like who the publisher is, which Bruce will talk about more. That's his area of expertise. It could be the fact that Photoshop was used. And in the AI realm, it could be the fact that this is known to have been made by a generative model, not by a human, or it's a mix of things. The ingredients include an AI model generated piece and a human generated piece. We think that people have a fundamental right to know that information, and content credentials provides it. So ultimately, provenance is the ground truth about what something is, where it came from, and who's vouching for it. Potentially all three, potentially one of those. Not a detection mechanism. This is not a post hoc way to say, it appears with an 80% confidence interval that this was made by Midjourney or something else. It's instead a way to prove ground truth rather than try to apply some sort of heuristic about detecting whether something is, quote, fake.
And just on that topic of detection, I think it's really interesting to contrast provenance with detection, because we looked at detection very early in our voyage to try and figure out what the methods we could use for this problem was, and came to the conclusion detection will never work. It may work for short periods of time in very limited circumstances, but it doesn't work at scale, and it doesn't work continuously. And one of the things that shocked us when we really started to get into it was we discovered there was ethical problems with detectors, because a good detector, when put in the field, will make the fakes better. And will therefore make it self-redundant, but it will also, just by the nature of the way AI systems work, a good detector, that information feeding back in a feedback loop will train the generator to make a better fake. So in the end, we said the only way that we can reliably do this with certainty is to actually shift the bias to say, okay, prove that it's true rather than detect that it's fake.
Yeah, and I would add something that is sometimes obvious, but I myself forget, I have to remind myself. The notion of trust is a fraught one. This word means lots of different things to lots of different people. Truth and trust are difficult words because they're just so laden with semantics. Again, we mean, do you trust you as an individual trust that this is what it purports to be. Ultimately, that's what we're at. You know, if something purports to have come from the BBC or the CBC or Fox News, can you verifiably, cryptographically be sure that it is what it says it is? And that's ultimately what this is. Trust, after all, is between people and organizations, not between machines and generative AI models.
Right. The example I use is if it says it comes from the Department of North Korea's propaganda arm, and it really did come from the Department of North Korea's propaganda arm, and it hasn't been altered since it left North Korea, you will have a signal that says this is authentic North Korean propaganda. You don't necessarily have truth.
Great. Yeah, I think those are some really interesting points, and I think we'll come back to this idea of trust and how fraught it is and potential trade-offs there. But first, I just wanted to go back. It was already been mentioned, the C2PA. Maybe it'd be good to explain a little bit more about what the C2PA is. Us as the CPA, it'd be good to distinguish ourselves. So it obviously aims to combat online misinformation through these technical standards and certify provenance of certain pieces of media. But could you provide a little bit more guidance on exactly how these technical standards work, and also maybe some of the primary motivations behind the initiative? Maybe we start with Bruce.
You describe the technology. Well, let's let Andy describe the technology. That's his space, and I can maybe describe the motivations.
Beautiful. Andy, please
Bruce
go
first.
Go ahead, Andy. You go first.
Okay, sure. I'll go first. Yeah, so from a technical point of view, one of the things the C2PA did, and I'll say both the organization Bruce is involved with, Project Origin, and our Content Authenticity Initiative, which I think now has something like 2,000 members, we always endeavored as individual companies and separate organizations to have completely free, developed in public, open standard. And we went to the Linux Foundation under a structure they have there. I think many of your viewers will be familiar with the Linux Foundation. It's a well-known entity for developing technical standards and open source code that can go on to be ratified by international standards bodies like the W3C and ISO. And the reason for that, from the inception of this idea, as Bruce and I both described, we knew that this had to be not the domain of one company or a consortium of companies focused on other things, but a new kind of consortium and collaboration that could move very quickly, embrace the viewpoints, the diverse viewpoints of human rights organizations, NGOs, governments to some extent, technology companies, and everyone else, academics included. And that would have to be a new nonprofit. So the C2PA ultimately is this nonprofit entity developing technical specs. The technical spec, to focus there for a minute, is it endeavored to do a number of things. Among our guiding principles, I'll highlight here, are to be privacy preserving. If someone doesn't want to expose or specifically assert who they are, they don't have to do that. If an individual doesn't want to capture GPS coordinates because that might perhaps put them in danger, they don't have to do that. So the technology allows that. It also endeavors to not invent anything novel or new unless it absolutely has to. So it uses public key cryptography. This is effectively the same kind of digital signature you use to sign a lease or a legal document, but applied to media. So the way we tell you through a content credential that something is what it says it is to look at who signed it and the assertions that signer made. So assertions, part of the C2PA parlance, could be things like, where was this taken? Who's the photographer? Who's the publisher? What kind of camera was used? And we have partners like Sony, who sits on the steering committee, who've announced camera support, Leica, who has a camera in market that does all these things. So you can think of the C2PA technical spec, which is 100 pages of cure for insomnia, but it is detailed and dense and comprehensive. It's a recipe for a data model of these assertions that indicate what happened to this content, and then a recipe for a digital signature that sort of binds the whole thing to the content itself. And last thing I'll mention that is novel and interesting, and not usually the realm of digital signatures, is a chaining together of a provenance trail, meaning if you take a GenAI ingredient and a photograph and make changes, all of those, the entire genealogy is captured in a very small amount of compressed data as a content credential. So you can know that Bruce took a photo and Andy modified it. Again, if I choose to share my identity, that this was modified in Photoshop, that Adobe Firefly or another GenAI tool was used. And what you get is this chained, unbreakable list of provenance ingredients and kind of stages of the development of that content again, ultimately, so that transparency can underlie the trust that we hope to imbue.
Maybe I'll jump in and talk about motivations. As broadcasters and news organizations, we started looking at disinformation attacks a couple of years ago and started to see one vector of attack was very short-term timed attacks, where you needed to be able to fool a lot of people for a short period of time. It may get ultimately disclosed, but over a 24 or 48-hour period before an election, when a stock price is vulnerable because of an earnings announcement, those sorts of things, where a credible source giving you disinformation could do really serious harm. And as a broadcaster, what we started looking at is what's the potential for someone to create fakes and puppets, effectively, of our hosts on our sets saying things that weren't true, that we never actually put to air. And to use all of the power of our brands and the trust in our brands to amplify misinformation. And we're seeing that happen right now. We're seeing it happen with the BBC in the Ukraine. We're seeing it happening all over the world where things that are coming out that purport to be from trusted broadcasters aren't really from trusted broadcasters. With the accessibility of these tools becoming more universal, we saw that noise in the system starting to increase and said, what are we going to do to counter it? And the conclusion we came to is ultimately we're going to have to sign our work and say, if it comes from us, it's signed and sealed. If the tamper evidence seal is there, if the Tylenol bottle doesn't have the seal on it, don't necessarily trust what's inside. Might still be okay, but you can't be sure anymore. And we said, okay, if we're going to take that approach, what's the way to do it? And the C2PA tamper evident manifest is the way that we're going to seal the media and assert our identity. As we said, identity is optional. And if you're in a hostile regime, you might not want your identity to be known. But if you're the BBC, if you're the CBC, if you're the New York Times, you want your identity to be known. And we're standing behind something and we're saying, look, we signed this. This is our work. You can trust what's inside if you see the seal is intact. And that's the approach we're starting to take to market.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Bruce. Yeah, I think this is, I'm sure, music to a lot of our stakeholders' ears that this work is being done, and it sounds so watertight. To go back to that issue of transparency, trust, and how trust is fraught, and you can't really force somebody to trust something. Trust is subjective. But often when it comes to online content, the lay person will say, look, just tell me, can I trust this? Yes, no. Don't give me this technical information that I don't really know how to translate. So is there a trade-off between providing that full transparency and everything that comes with it, and the comprehensibility of the information that's being provided? And maybe as a supplementary question, is there therefore a requirement for promoting more literacy around these kinds of standards? And where does the responsibility for building that literacy fall? Is that at the individual level? Is it at the governance level? So yeah, a few questions into one, but happy to take them perhaps one at a time. And maybe this time we start with Bruce.
I think you have to ask who the user is, first of all. And there's a distinction between the general public just sitting back in the evening watching a television show or exploring something on the internet versus an investigative reporter who's received some content and wants to really dig down to make sure the veracity of that content before they relay it on to their audience. So there's sometimes you want to be able to drill down and do forensic accounting, and the C2PA tool has all the tools to go down and do that. Sometimes you just want to do a general check on input. So I've got a reporter in the field. It's a citizen reporter or a stringer I've used in a hostile regime. I may not even know his name, but I do know it's the same guy that sent me a photo 2 weeks ago because it's coming from the same set of cameras and with the same set of IDs. So I've got the history of the, he told me the truth last week. I can take that into my trust decision on do I use him this week. So again, that's the professional input side, is very different than the general public on the output side. The general public on the output side has other filters before it ever gets to them. The social media companies have algorithms that are going to promote or demote content, right? So a lot of what's designed in C2PA is designed to be machine-to-machine readable. This is coming from a trusted source, therefore I can move it up the rankings. It's coming from someone I've never seen before in my life. I may put it down the rankings, or I may route it to some human that's doing fact-checking. The social media companies have fact checkers who are absolutely overwhelmed with the volume that's coming through for them, and something that can triage and take the safe stuff and route it away and let them focus on the really high use cases is of value. Ultimately, it does come down to the individual. Ultimately, they will have to start making some informed judgment, so that there's media education and media literacy aspects to this. And as C2PA gets more rolled out, and we have to wait until there's critical mass of content to do this, because there's actually harm if you start to tell people to look for something too soon and it isn't on enough content. But as critical mass of content starts to build, the media companies ourselves have a vested interest to tell our audiences, hey, we now sign our work, this is what it means, right? So if you can start to see, and because there's a universal community coming together, if we're all telling that same message, that media education can start to roll out relatively effectively.
Yeah, I agree with you on all those points, Bruce. And I think coming back to the original question, transparency and comprehensibility are a trade-off. Like, I think we have to be honest with ourselves. Like, full transparency could be as complex as seeing, I described the technical kind of means to have that provenance trail, but that's a lot of information. And frankly, most consumers don't need that much information. And in some of the user research that C2PA and Adobe has done, we find that reinforced over and over again. It's like, as you couched it, just tell me if this is fake or not, which is, the inverse of, can I trust this? Yes, no. Tell me if this is generated by AI. Was it or wasn't it? Tell me if this is a photograph. So a lot of the work we do in the C2PA UX task force is around balancing comprehensibility and transparency. So if you want a green check mark that says you can trust this, a la the old, Twitter X check mark of verified identity, you have to add another layer of trust. You have to trust the party who's telling you that, right? The C2PA is not a truth detector or a lie detector. Just as, going back decades or more, even a photograph might be a photograph of a lie, right? Somebody might be posing in a certain way or simulating something that didn't happen. But with the democratization and accessibility of AI tools that make photorealistic things for free, low cost or free, mostly free, open source models, things like that, again, there's this fundamental right I think we all have, at least in democratic society, to understand what something is. So those high-level trust signals, like, is this a photo or not, should bubble up to the top. And that's, I think, how you balance the comprehensibility of transparency with the, comprehensiveness with comprehensibility of a signal. Like, this was generated by AI. Cool. Do I care which model generated it? Maybe, maybe not. So in the C2PA UX task force, and many of the implementations that are coming online, including ours and Photoshop and Adobe Express, you'll see layers of disclosure, if you will. One is a top-level layer that says, this asset has content credentials. It's not the, yes, can I trust it or not? It says there's more context here. If you want to know what it is, click here. But one of the things we're looking at and continue to look at is, are there high-level signals that should be elevated all the way to the top, so that next to an image or proximate to a video or inside your video player, you can say, 90% of this was generated by an AI model. It wasn't made by a human. Or this is in fact a photograph. Or to Bruce's point, this absolutely certifiably, verifiably came from CBC or the Associated Press or someone else. So I think there's a trade-off, but the path ahead of us is to find the right balance. And I think it's probably the case that that balance is not the same across cultures and languages and different parts of the world.
And the context of the content itself. AI is not necessarily a bad thing, and synthetically generated is not a bad thing. Picture a newscast where there's a volcano going off in Iceland, and people want to give a sense of what is it like inside the volcano. The images and the things, you can't put a camera in there, right? But to explain it, you might pull up something like an AI generated image that can, in context, say, look, this gives you a sense of what's going on. It's part of the storytelling toolkit. And as long as it's disclosed that it's not real and it's not meant to be deceptive, being synthetically generated is not bad. So we have to be careful not to make the correlation that organically generated photos are good and synthetic ones are bad. Newscasts and storytellers will, in different contexts, use this in different ways, and it's about being truthful and not deceptive.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, 100% right. We're Adobe, right? My employer is Adobe. We think editing is good and creative pursuits are good. Like they often will use. We've had AI in our tools for a long time, far before the kind of deep interest and explosion of generative AI. We now have generative tools in Photoshop and Premiere and other places. Like that stuff is good if it makes people produce better work, higher volumes, work more efficiently, all those things. So a label like that, again, it's not saying don't trust this, which a platform might apply to something that's not a photograph in a news context. But as Bruce pointed out, there are probably lots of creative uses we have yet to see where, for storytelling purposes, as long as you have disclosure and it's not used in a deleterious way to deceive people, it's great. And in fact, many experts in the field believe that 90% plus of the media we will consume, even in the next 5 years, will have some AI generated component, whether it's a caption or pixels or frames of a video. The key is to be transparent about what it is, and in some cases where it came from.
Yeah, thanks both. Yeah, I think it's really clear that this isn't really a tool for making value judgments, although the individual user can choose to do that after they get all the information that they need. But yeah, it's just about providing that base level of information. And yeah, Andy, I can say that I've seen a lot of the fun applications of Adobe's AI software on social media. So yeah, absolutely, we don't want to scare anyone away from generative AI, scare anyone away from synthetic media in the absolute. It's about that disinformation, subversive element. So yeah, I think that came through really, really strong. And I also just want to pick up, Bruce, you were sort of talking about sort of quite instantaneous input that some media companies have. It might be somebody on the ground, and I think we see that quite a lot in media now, including in some of those conflict zones. Somebody has a smartphone, they can immediately take a photo or a video of something that's happening locally to them and send it to media. And I think media is increasingly using that sort of media. And in the age of 24-hour coverage, breaking news, when instant coverage is expected by many consumers, do you see that there are challenges for the media when it comes to avoiding that AI-generated disinformation, or really having the time to sit, check, do we trust this? Or is there that tension of, well, if my competitors are sending out news really, really quickly, and once you've got somebody's attention, you've got it. Do you see, and maybe this is a question more for Bruce than for Andy, do you see that as an issue?
Well, it's an issue today, and it's going to continue to be an issue going forward, right? There's a pressure to break stories quickly, and there's a pressure to make sure that you don't get fooled. And that is the art, and it's an art of journalism, right? Where these people just are constantly checking the stuff on the way in. What this is giving our journalists is one more tool for validation, right? So that they can make judgments quicker. And if they've built up a history, as I said, with individuals, they'll be fine. You really think of it as a series of known things. As a broadcaster, I may be sending my film crew out with my cameras, in which case I know the serial numbers of the cameras and the material signed and it's coming in from known. It may be someone I have a relationship with. It's a stringer I've used in the past and all that. So I've got at least a history with that person. They don't necessarily work for us, but there's a history. And again, different sort of thing. Versus there's a car crash on the interstate. Someone happened to be passing, grabbed their iPhone, shot a little bit of footage, and sent it off to us. Someone I've never heard of, never seen before, not even sure there really was a car crash. Right, that kind of judgment is a little bit harder. Where if the person is using a registered camera and a registered phone, that may help a little bit. At least perhaps the XY coordinates of where it was on the planet and when it was taken. Assuming those things have been properly entered into the camera, that helps. But it still doesn't mean you don't have to validate and fact check. I mean, the process of journalism hasn't changed. This is just one more tool in their quiver, an arrow in their quiver to get the job done.
Yeah, and there's also the notion of what's sometimes called the content supply chain. So as Bruce knows, and I'm learning, in the news industry, you have wholesalers, retailers, photographers, media that's licensed from the Associated Press or Reuters, both Content Authenticity Initiative members. There's real value we hear from the field in making sure that the retailers like the New York Times, who may be buying licensing Associated Press media, for example, know that it came from the Associated Press, no matter how it got to them. So even though these are closed ecosystems, sometimes it's very useful to maintain that provenance trail up to the moment of publication, potentially beyond. But ultimately, if you trust the New York Times, you're going to trust the New York Times to have presented something using its known methods for information integrity. The challenge, as we've touched on, is when that stuff leaves the New York Times or leaves the Associated Press, ends up on social media or somewhere else, where it's no longer being displayed in the context where it was originated, if you will. Digital certificates, SSL browser locks are perfectly fine to say, yeah, I'm actually on the New York Times site, within some reasonable confidence vector. But once that media ends up somewhere else, on TikTok, on other platforms, it's really important to remain confident that that tether back to the original, back to the origin, is intact. And that's ultimately what this is all about. I think that's as relevant in breaking news and broadcast. We have a team in the CTBA working on live video for this exact reason, possibly in time for the many elections we have coming up. But the connection back to the origin is key. And it's as important in recorded media as it is in live media of all kinds. And by the way, the CTPA covers images, audio, and video. And there's even an open source streaming player that will do adaptive bitrate, YouTube and Netflix style, so that you can have confidence that every chunk of video as it arrives to you in a streaming context is equally verifiable, just like an image would be.
The media companies as sources is really, Andy talked about the supply chain, but we sit there and say, trust us, right? So there's an upstream value that we may see and may not pass on. If the New York Times has got a reporter in a forward operating base in a conflict zone, providing the XY coordinates and where he is and when he is isn't necessarily a good thing, right? So that they will redact that information and say, look, it's stamped by the New York Times. Take our word for it, and that's really where our brand stands, or that's where the CBC brand stands. So that's important. The other thing that's becoming very important is our archives. So generative AI has a way where it can recast history. There was a viral video going around about 2 months ago of the gentleman standing in front of the tanks in Tiananmen Square, taking a video or taking a selfie of himself. File went everywhere, except that was 20 years before the iPhone was invented and selfies weren't a thing. But it changed the context of history. And one of the things we have in the CBC and the BBC archives and the New York Times archives and media archives all over the world is an authoritative view of history, right? So when things come out of our archives, we can say, this came from CBC, it was retrieved from our archives in 2023. It's a picture of what happened in World War II. And this, comes with our stamp and our seal of authority. So it's that grounding of ground truth in a time when history may come a little untethered, is the other role that we see ourselves playing with this. And again, this just gives us a way to assert our authority and our brand on a particular media file.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I just want to pick you up on some of the things you were saying there, Bruce. I think for a large chunk of the population they'll look at actors like the BBC, the New York Times, and say, this is mainstream media. Yeah, they seem authoritative. We can trust them. There's that. I maybe we call them just the minority of people who look at the biggest actors as the least trustworthy. Do you ever have those issues where people say, oh, well, yeah, you're saying trust us, you have this standard, but you're a cabal? Do you ever have that? And do you have to resign yourself to the fact that there are just those people who don't trust you, will never trust you, but it's about trying to get the majority to appreciate that? Or are we again falling into that trap of trying to go after trust when it's more about transparency?
This is about trusting the math. If the cryptographic math says it really comes from the person it says it's coming from, we can at least establish that path is not really subject to debate. That part's done. Then you can get down to the fundamentals of, do you trust big media or would you rather talk to some small independents? And that debate's not going to go away, and this technology is not going to change that. But at least you can make sure that it's not some individual in their basement pretending to be big media and then saying, oh, look, they reported it and it's wrong. You know, it's okay not to trust us, but it really should be us you're not trusting, not somebody purporting to be us. And the same goes for any independent media person. If you want to assert who you are and build a following, and a lot of these small guys want to build a following, well, you need to be able to say, this is me, and this is the same guy I was last week, and here's the ways you can start to understand who I am and how I can have trust as a small entity.
Yeah, but I also want to point out, you know, trust signals and trust decisions don't have to be based only or even primarily on the identity of the publisher. That's one of the strongest ones, while we still live in a world where certain news brands are trustworthy and others are not to an individual. However, you know, it is also true that simply knowing that something hasn't been miscontextualized by date, you know, Bruce gave a good example earlier. There are countless others, like riots purporting to take place in Seattle a few years ago that actually are from another nation, from, you know, photographed by a now deceased photographer 20 years ago. Wildfires claiming to be in Australia that were actually photographed in Texas. Now, those things may not be meaningful to somebody reading a story and getting the context, but if you want to know if this is a photograph of an individual, and still more damaging, that this politician or public figure or you, you know, being made to say and do things you never said or did, it is knowable whether that's a video of you or not. And again, people have a fundamental right to know that. So these basic signals, like not only knowing where it came from, but what it is, again, ground truth of C2PA, what is this media I'm looking at? Those are incredibly valuable. If we don't have it, if we don't get on the road to having that on all of our media, I think we're in trouble. It actually threatens conversations like this one, where we're basing our discourse today on a basic shared understanding of objective truth about how the world works. If we are to lose that as a democratic society, or frankly as a species, then I think we're in real trouble. And if we don't do something, you know, Bruce and I would say the something we can do now that is deployable now is C2PA. But if we don't do something together as a society and a conglomeration of tech companies and publishers and arbiters of certain kinds of trust, then we won't trust anything. And I'm sure, you know, I know we all heard the term liar's dividend, but if everything can be called into question, then really nothing can be known to be true. Which is why, as we've said, we focused on that kind of, how is it made? What's the origin of this thing? Is it from a camera? And it was cryptographically signed and tamper evident. It's a minimal guarantee, but a really, really important one.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks both. And yeah, absolutely agree that that anchor point of objective truth, if you lose that, then really all bets are off for public discourse. And on that, we've already referenced the fact of disinformation during election periods, and next year certainly has a number of big elections, not just across the CPA's membership, but one I think all of our audience are well aware of is the US presidential election as well. And maybe none of us have a crystal ball, but maybe a sort of prognosis on next year in the election cycles and that sense of urgency that got mentioned. Do you think this is something that we really need to get on to now, given so many of our democracies are going to the polls next year? And maybe I'll start with Bruce.
Yes, it's an urgent problem. Do we wish we started this 20 years ago? Maybe, when we first rolled out the internet. Maybe we're playing a little bit of catch up, and are we going to catch up by September or November? Maybe not fully, but on specific links of the chain, you know, point to point. Before everybody is looking for things, there are certain business cases where you need to know this really did leave the White House. It really was received at the NBC studios, and they've got that piece covered. You know, so point-to-point deployments for specific use cases can start to be used and deliver value well before this is a broad consumer technology. And I think you'll start to see some of that falling out into place by this fall.
Yeah, I think I also regret not starting this sooner in the early days of the initiative. I think probably Bruce and I were both asked, it's about time. Why didn't you do this 5 years ago, let alone 20 years ago? I've also had occasion to talk to one of the early pioneers of the internet, one of the inventors of the internet, and ask that person, like, if you could go back in time, would you put a layer of trust, you know, again, very loaded word, semantic laden, but would you put some sort of trust layer, a web of trust, if you will? And I was told, yes, of course, obviously we would have done that. But nobody knew what was to come. The internet has been, was intended to be, and should continue to be a place where free speech is welcome and identity isn't always required. But when it comes to elections, again, as Bruce said eloquently, we need to know what this media is. A verbal audio recording of Joe Biden or Rishi Sunak saying, "I am who I say I am, and I endorse this advertisement," is useless, right? I think it's useless now. It certainly will be in the coming years and next year. It's already too easy to create deepfake voices or synthetic voices with what used to be 10 minutes of training data can now be relegated to seconds of training data to make a voice clone of any one of us. Ethical use of those tools is one place where content provenance is key, but the other is not only disclosing that something is generated. I think certainly we've seen and we will continue to see generative media, synthetic media used in campaigns. One might say it has no place in campaigns, but I think the ship is sailing, the cat's out of the bag, it will be used. As long as it's disclosed, I think we'll be okay. But when you have a White House press conference or a number 10 speech, we better be able to know that this is coming from a video camera or video feed. When we're doing a video conference like this recording we're doing right now on a video media platform, we should be able to know that this is actually Bruce and not a puppet of Bruce or me. So those kinds of things I think can come online probably towards the end of next year. But I also want to take this opportunity to emphasize that the C2PA is not just a voluminous spec I made fun of earlier as a cure for insomnia. It's also reified in open source. It's in a bunch of products, including some that Bruce and I are personally involved in. And there are real commercial implementations and deployments, one of which that's relevant to your direct question, Microsoft announced a couple of weeks ago, which is content credentials as a service for political campaigns in the US going into the election next year. So this is not theoretical. It's not, gosh, I wish we could have this. We can have this. And the more we can spread awareness, as today's event will help do, the more this can be adopted. And I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic than Bruce that there will be effective measures in place, certainly a year from now.
Great, fantastic. And then sticking with the electoral side of things, the democracy side of things, and also thinking a little bit about where we wish we started this sooner and getting more stakeholders involved. We have 500 legislators, ministers, policymakers, researchers, heads of departments within government attending this conference. And maybe I'll just end with what role could the legislators, the policymakers play when it comes to technical standards like C2PA? Is there a promotional role they can play, maybe even a legislative role they can play? So maybe we'll finish with maybe not a plea from yourselves, but maybe some advice and some onboarding for our audience. What would you like to see them do to support you both? And maybe I'll start with you, Andy.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think there's maybe not a plea, but a call to action for legislators and regulators and policy folks. Disclaimer, I'm not a policy expert, so I won't speak from that point of view. But a year ago, had you asked me, I would have said, well, it remains to be seen whether legislation is necessary in different jurisdictions throughout the world. Now I would say it appears that things are moving that way. And again, in the spirit of urgency, one of the things legislation and regulation is good at is accelerating a trend towards something that democratic society needs. And I think that that's where legislation will be helpful. You're already seeing it in the online safety bill, other work being done in the UK, in the US with the Biden executive order, and many pieces of legislation floating around Congress now. And of course, the AI Act in Europe all have pieces of provenance, and I think some even name the C2PA. My call to action would be, if there's going to be legislation, and provenance is part of that legislation, this notion of transparency, which is a platform upon which you can build other kinds of safety and trust, then let's make sure there's one standard way to do that. And this is where standards organizations can help, and governments can lock arms with standards promotion organizations to make sure that when legislation or regulation reaches for a provenance technique, that there only be one and not a disparate, disjointed set that are not compatible with one another.
I'd underline that as somebody that buys technology rather than sells technology. I want to make sure that I have a range of options that I can choose from, and I want to make sure they work with each other. And I want to make sure that when I send my content to other companies that have made different technology choices, they can read it and still work through it. So guiding people towards one common standard will make our lives easier as media companies. That's the reason we got involved in Project Origin and ultimately in C2PA and the CAI, was to say, look, let's build a community. Let's make sure the requirements are known, that they're broad, that they work for all of us, and then let's do this once and do it right. And a common set of standards is really the way to go. And it's been the approach for the last couple of years, I guess now.
Brilliant.
So anything legislators can do to encourage that, I guess, is the call to action. You know, and the fact that we've got the C2PA standard now working, I think is helpful.
Great, thank you both so much. As I say, I think today during the conference and certainly during this session, it's very much about making our stakeholders aware that these things exist. It's not the Wild West online all the time, at least. And there is this fight back against the disinformation and misinformation. We know from conversations we've had with our stakeholders that it's a serious concern for them, and we certainly don't want to frighten our stakeholders. So I think hearing these conversations, knowing these standards exist, that there is scope for them to engage with these and play a role and support the adoption, the awareness of these standards, growing literacy around them, and that they can join that push is really I hope very positive, and will certainly feed into our next session that we're having with the Honourable Marco Mendocino from the Parliament of Canada, looking a little bit more about what the role of the parliamentarian and Parliament and other democratic institutions is in the fight against disinformation, misinformation. So with that, I'll close the session and say thanks to both yourself, Andy, and yourself, Bruce. I know you have another big conference on all these issues, and it's a growing area for a lot of people. So thank you so much for joining us, and all the very best.
So welcome back, everybody. This is the fourth and final session of day two. I know an early start for many, but for different time zones, probably a more convenient time. The final session of the day is on AI governance, balancing freedom of expression with effective regulation. The session will aim to address the delicate balance between fostering innovation in AI and ensuring robust regulatory frameworks that protect fundamental freedoms, particularly freedom of expression. A very difficult but crucial ask, and I think it's an issue that we've touched upon in the conference both today and yesterday. AI technologies, with their potential for widespread impact, pose unique challenges to the traditional regulatory approaches. We've already touched briefly upon how the rapid pace of AI development is often outstripping the ability of legislation and policy to keep up, leading to what we call a regulatory gap. So I think this session will explore in more detail how governments, international bodies, and other stakeholders are responding to these challenges and seeking to establish governance structures that are both effective and respectful of human rights. For this session, we'll hear from our two panelists, who I'm pleased to be joined by, who I'll introduce both shortly. Before we'll then have a time for Q&A at the end of both presentations. So as always with all these sessions, we have the chat box and the Q&A function within Zoom to pose written questions, and you can pose these at any points in the presentation or session. And during the Q&A portion, myself and colleagues will do our best to go through those and pose them to both of our panelists. So without further ado, I'll be pleased to introduce our first speaker. Maria Luisa Stasi is a competition lawyer by background with expertise in media, telecoms, and internet technologies. She currently leads Article 19's law and policy work concerning digital markets, focusing on the use of economic regulation and competition law and policy to advance the protection of free expression online. Maria Luisa is also a researcher at the Tilburg Law School. So with that, Maria Luisa, I'll be happy to give the floor to yourself.
Thank you, Jack, for the invitation. Thank you, everybody. Indeed, you must have a very, very early start, which is extremely appreciated. I'll try to entertain. So when Jack kindly approached me and asked me to discuss AI governance and kind of impact it had on free expression. I thought, yes, sure, definitely. But then when I was going to narrow down what I could have said in this 10-15 minutes, I thought I was just trying to put the entire ocean into a little box. So what is going to follow is very much my cherry picking, and it's a couple of preliminary considerations. We're then zooming in on one or two specific cases that I think are pretty important for free expression, but are also quite common to find in different places in the UK, in Europe, but also in many other different areas around the world. Having said that, the kind of introduction, Jack said, I am a lawyer by background, so this I'll try not to keep this too legalistic or formal. Now that AI governance is a legal concept, it's a very multi-dimension concept. So this is somehow an easy task this time. But yes, so let's kick off with this preliminary conversation. So when we talk about AI, we talk about a very, very vast area. So necessarily, I'm going to focus on a few AI systems that are specifically important for free expression. But what I think it's a good starting point for this conversation is that when we talk about AI governance and regulation, being regulation a component of the governance or a complementary concept, this is it depends who you talk to, I suppose. We're not talking about necessarily something that is yet to happen or something that is completely new. It's something that, in a way or another, we have had in place. So the key point for me is not how to introduce regulation or governance, but how to optimize this, how to make it fit for purpose. And this is where the challenges start, because what is the purpose of it? So we do have to define AI, and then we need to define what's the purpose of governance and regulation. And those are very important discussions that I would say should happen at different layers. But because the main trait of these systems is that they are transnational, this is one of the reasons why we see loads of transnational initiatives. So this idea of ethical principles for AI or governance or regulation have been brought to a number of different international fora. And this is happening already. It has been happening already for quite a few years, possibly a decade or so. So in a way, AI governance is difficult to define, but it is becoming very, very popular. I found a nice number that sort of give the idea. The OECD counts governance-related AI national policies in at least 69 states, and in many, many instances, is more than one AI governance policy per state. So the total amounts to more than 500, for example, in 69 states. So that is possibly to give a little bit of a dimension to this. I said that it's difficult to define AI governance because in a number of countries I've figured out that people discuss about AI sovereignty rather than governance, which includes the capacity to understand, develop, and regulate AI. And when we talk about what could be the key AI sovereignty enablers, we find definitely sound governance for data and personal data specifically, algorithmic governance, strong computational capacity, but we also find elements such as meaningful connectivity and digital literate population, which sort of infers or hint to the direction that what we need to talk cannot be only a top-down exercise, but it has some bottom-up elements, and it also depends and needs to be tailored on the specific citizenship that we can have in a specific area. Anyway, AI governance is just one of the form of governance that we're discussing at transnational level. Now, many of you will be familiar with the ESG, environmental and social governance. So my second question when I was thinking about what's the status quo of AI governance when it comes to free expression specifically, I thought that there are maybe other lessons, other sectors where we can go and look at and learn some lessons, if nothing else, in terms of what kind of principles we should have that sort of constitute the bottom ground of the governance, which kind of models for the governance, the benchmarks. The main point remains operationalization, I would say. What are the best practices for that? Once we identify the principles, how we can get down to then applying them. I would say in this, maybe we can look at different levels. So we can have governance within the company. And there I would say the key challenges are to make decision makers, managers, understand what we're talking about. Many of them want to have a technical background. So this is not necessarily an easy exercise. We might need to build capacity. And also we might need to sort of institutionalize dialogue between different functions in a company. I would say that usually these kind of efforts take the form of self or co-regulation where the state imposes some sort of regulation that goes in that direction, and it's a dialogue between the regulator and the company. But most of the time it's a self-regulation, meaning that it's the company itself that decides what to do and how to insert this kind of mechanism internally. Then we can look at governance, AI governance, not within a single company, but within a sector. And we've seen this already happening. And there is where I think the standard setting organization comes in, because when we enlarge the focus from the specific company to the sector is where we start seeing a number of standard technical standards coming into play. And I would say the more a self-regulatory initiative it tends to be, or it could more easily be a co-regulatory initiative. And then we have a geographical level, which is national, but also regional and international. I've already mentioned that there are a number of international fora where we're discussing a variety of elements of possible AI governance. I would say there the main challenges change. One of the first is definitely how to make sure the decision making happens in the public interest. So how to make sure that the public interest is duly considered in this decision making. And the second key challenge is enforcement. Do we have a system that can guarantee the enforcement of whatever kind of governance model we pick? And this is especially so, I would say, at transnational, international level. In all these layers, I think, and especially when it comes to the international component, but also the sectorial component of governance, there is an element which we might discuss later on, which is about who holds the power. So we're not talking about a huge variety or diversity of players, but as some of these layers, when we talk about AI governance, we're very much addressing a few big players, and so there might be also an issue of how to inject a multi-stakeholder component into this governance and enforcement mechanisms, considering that very often the power to make these decisions and to design, develop, and deploy AI is quite concentrated. So I've mentioned that there are a number of initiatives, and so just to complete the background picture and then go into specific issues of AI and free expression, I would say in this part of the world at least, so when it comes to Europe and the UK, a couple of initiatives that I'd like to point at is the OECD principles of AI and the parallel initiative, the Global Partnership on AI. It's an interesting exercise. The introduction is very much about international multi-stakeholder initiative. The language goes into responsible development and use of artificial intelligence with human rights, fundamental freedoms, shared democratic values, all reflected in the OECD recommendation for AI. So it's very much human rights oriented and democracy oriented. and it seems to sort of there seems to be another other kind of initiatives that go in a similar direction. The G20 AI principles, also the UK AI summit was discussing this kind of slogan, let's say, or principles. So if we want, there might be a tendency to sort of more than a tendency, a global convergence around some of these ethical principles. And justice, fairness, liability, privacy and respect for human rights, transparency. I would argue that, of course, those are all nice principles, but they're extremely vague. And so on the one side, the operationalization and enforcement will remain key. On the other side, there is no one size fits all. So we can't just use all those very big concepts or vague concepts for every specific issue that we have or will have in the next future. So this is a complex picture for policymakers and regulators. The last premise I wanna make before I go into specific elements is that I don't think I generally, of course, I come from a free expression angle. So I'm here as representative of Article 19, but also in my research at Tilburg University, I focus on free expression problems in digital markets and how to fix them using different toolboxes, one of this being pro-competitive remedies that could be imposed by competition authorities, etc. I do understand that sometimes the conversation is presented as a dichotomy. It's innovation versus democratic values. We either go for fast developments or we slow everything down and we try to protect human rights. I think to a certain extent, these are false dichotomies. I think it's not an either or, but it's definitely an issue of finding a balance. So trade-off will be unavoidable, I would say. In a way also necessary, but they can be carefully assessed and decided upon through very democratic processes, or they can be decided behind closed doors and imposed to a number of people and countries. I would definitely go for the first if possible. That's why I think that it's important to have multi-stakeholder involvement, but I also think it's important to make sure that all these processes are not focused in the global north, because even if the vast majority of companies interested in the design, deployment, and development of these technologies are based in the global north, whatever they do or don't do will have huge impact also in the global south. So this is absolutely necessary, I believe, when we talk about multi-stakeholderism, to make sure that the global south is adequately represented. And all the stakeholders from the global south are not only civil society, but also governments and the industry and all the other relevant stakeholders. Okay, so let's agree on the fact that we haven't solved the problem, but at least we know where we're placing ourselves in this conversation. And let's zoom in on why AI is important or a problem or an enabler for free expression, because those two things, they go pretty much together, I would say. I'm gonna there are a number of areas where this is so. I'm gonna focus on two. So one is automated systems for content moderation and content curation, and the other one is biometric technologies. And when I talk about the first, for me is important to differentiate the content moderation. So I'm going to talk about content moderation and content curation, or content recommendation. Why they're different? Content moderation, for the sake of the conversation, let's say, is about moderating illegal content or content that is prohibited by a platform based on its own terms of services. But the majority of the time, we're talking about removing or suspending accounts that circulate illegal content based on national rules. So we're possibly talking about child pornography, terrorist content, incitement to violence that complies with international standards, because all the rest, even if it's content that is quite annoying or provoking or disinformation, including disinformation, this is legal content. It's not illegal. So it's part of the vast ocean of free expression of everybody. So we know that on digital platforms, on social media and alike, the content moderation is mostly done by automated systems. And the major risk that we have there, which is major risk of free expression, is that this kind of filters, this kind of systems, they over-remove or censor certain voices. This can happen to content that shows some nudity or political slogan or health information. There have been cases where health information about teenager sexuality or abortion, they've been removed. Simply because they contain some words that were triggering some automated filters. So obviously the risk is there, and the risk is amplified by the volume, the velocity and speeds that and these filters need to operate at in order to be effective. We're talking about billions and billions of pieces of content on an hour basis. What matters there is the context, and this is the main clash between using automated systems and taking into account the content. That's why, from a free speech perspective, ideally, you would have humans in the loop. Ideally, you would have people that speak the language, to understand the context, that are able to understand the background and make a proper assessment. But as I said, with at that scale and with that speed, it's very difficult to implement. The second element is when the automated system that recommend or curate the content that we have access to. So it's the vast majority of the content. It's all the legal content that is out there. Why this impacts free expression? Because it has a huge influence on the flow of information at individual level, but also at community level. So basically, depending on the content recommendation or the content curation algorithm that is used by a platform, my exposure to diversity of content might be minimized or amplified in a way that me as a user, I'm not very capable of understanding. And this happens, as I said, at individual level, but also at societal level. So if a company holds this power, they can influence the public debate, they can influence the political agenda. And at individual level, they can basically diminish the contour of my cognitive autonomy. They set my information diet. I don't set my information diet anymore. So when it comes to these issues, AI governance is important, and it's sort of a mix with digital platforms governance, which is something we've discussed for 20 years. The good news is that with digital platform governance and with this automated systems, we have come to sort of, at least we're trying to implement solutions, regulatory solutions and governance solutions. In Europe, we've had the Digital Services Act, to a certain extent also the Digital Markets Act. In the AI Act, there will be provisions about this. The European Media Freedom Act, which is still discussed as the AI Act at the trialogue, contains provisions that address the content recommendation systems, and especially the relationship between content produced by media outlets and this kind of recommendations used by very large online platforms, so the social media platforms. So we're getting there. The direction of travel seems to be risk assessment and risk mitigation. So this is the foundation of what we're gonna have and we try to implement. There is a lot of reliance in a fair and as open as possible regulatory dialogue between the big platforms and the regulator. As Article 19, we have flagged in many instances that it is absolutely necessary to make this regulatory dialogue as open as possible to all the stakeholders. They might have a say in this and they can help, especially researchers. Researchers should have access to as much information as possible to be able to assess how the companies do the risk assessment and which kind of mitigation strategies they put in place, if to monitor them, if they're effective, they're not effective, what are the benchmarks, for effectiveness, how success looks like in these cases. This is a key issue, I would say, and we don't have. It doesn't seem to me that we have an answer to this. So all this is happening in Europe, is happening in the UK as well, but it's happening at these international fora that I mentioned before, although only at the level of principles for the time being. Obviously, the point is that every context is different. So the different governments around the globe willing to sort of implement similar or complementary regulation, they need to take into account the specificities of their context. The European Commission, it seems to me, is doing quite a campaign to promote the Digital Services Act as one of the best possible solutions. It might be a very good solution. We'll still need to see how it is going to be implemented, but certainly a copy-paste in different areas of the world won't work. They need to be adapted to the context. They need to take into account the different needs elsewhere, and they need to be tailor-made. So this flexibility, I think, is absolutely crucial. This goes also for the US, very, very briefly saying this, because in the US, the First Amendment implies that platforms have completely different rights from platforms in the EU. And so this creates different constraints for any possible governance system or regulatory system that wants to be imposed. But I'm conscious about time, so very, very briefly, I'll take 1 or 2 minutes, if I still can, to raise another issue or to sort of point at another environment where AI can be crucial for free expression. We at Article 19, we've done a lot of work on biometric technologies and specifically on face recognition and motion recognition, but in general, we're basically figured out that all these technologies, they have a huge potential to violate free expression. I would say the debate is usually focusing, and rightly so, on privacy, people's privacy or data protection, depending on the nuances and the layer of attention. But as mentioned by the special rapporteur for free expression already a few years ago, when it comes to the online dimension, the digital dimension, privacy and free expression, they can only artificially be separated. But in fact, they go very much end to end, and one reinforces the other. Without privacy in public spaces, people won't feel comfortable to express themselves. There is a massive chilling effect that we can see in different instances. So we have advocated for extreme care when it's about establishing governance systems for this kind of technologies. We've tried to sort of push back on at least 2 main points. One is this trend of tech solutionism. It seems that every time we have a problem, it doesn't matter what the problem is, the solution seems to be an increased use of biometric technology or surveillance technology. Fights against crime, use face recognition and your streets will be more secure. Do you have a problem with terrorism? Massive surveillance and you can solve it. Do you have a problem with car accidents and motion recognition in cars and people won't have accidents anymore? Do you need to guarantee the security of minors at school? Face recognition at the gates, and this is the way to go. Especially in the last case, I think a judge in Marseille a couple of years ago, in a judgment about the legality of a face recognition system at the entrance of a lycée, a secondary school, said that looking at this from the international standards and the test of proportionality, necessity, and legitimacy of violation of free expression and privacy based on the kind of objective you want to achieve. This face recognition system was like using a hammer to hit a hunt, and I think it's a clear indication of how disproportionate sometimes these solutions can be. So the first point is tech solutionism, and the second one is that we have normalized a number of business models in different sectors that are fundamentally based on data extraction and fundamentally based on profiling people and tracking them, whatever they do online. And until we have a serious discussion about these business models, whatever kind of governance system we're going to set for these systems that track and profile us, is going to be a very, very weak attempt. We need to consider that the root of this issue might be the business model as well. And we need to sort of consider how to attack that one. I mentioned at the very beginning that that was a vague attempt to put the ocean in a box. My selection was about those two specific systems. As you probably have understood, I still have loads of questions rather than specific answers. But I do believe that oftentimes the AI governance discussion is oversimplified. And in this oversimplification, the usual risk is that a number of voices and concerns, especially if they're not mainstream or economic in nature, will be forgotten. So I hope that by raising lights on a number of elements of this picture, I will help in the process of not forgetting those nuances that matter.
Many thanks, Marie-Louisa. Very insightful presentation. I know you did your best to cover as many areas in what is a very expansive field. So thank you for that. I will, for the sake of time, we'll move on to our second panelist, who will again provide some more balance and depth to this debate on AI governance and the balancing of freedom of expression and the role and use of regulation. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Chris Marsden. Chris is a Professor of Artificial Intelligence, Technology and the Law at Monash University, Director of the Digital Law Group at Monash, and Associate Director for Global Governance of the Data Futures Institute. He was co-director with Professor George Christou of the Brussels Effect of the AI Act expert workshops in 2023, awarded by the Warwick Monash Global Alliance. He was appointed to serve on the ARC College of Experts 2024 to 2026. So with that, Chris, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. And do stop me at 2 minutes to the hour, because people have places to go. So have a kind of virtual shepherd's crook taking me off the list. I'm going to share slides with you. Before I do, please, everyone, don't worry if my face changes colour during the presentation. The sun is setting here in Melbourne. It sets at just about 8 o'clock. And I was going to close the blind, and I realised that for people in particularly in Europe, they would probably be quite pleased to see some sunshine. So I've left it there. So I will share the presentation. I will make it full screen. James, you will tell me if you can see it properly or not. Sorry, Jack, can you see it okay?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Right. And I've borrowed your graphics, so thank you for that.
You have? Very good.
I'm going to talk about the most pressing issue, I think, which is disinformation. First of all, by the way, this is Nina Schick, of course, an AI-generated image of herself, a deepfake expert. And it's partly an advert for tomorrow's speech I'm giving at the Asia Internet Coalition. So for those people in my time zone, there'll be more. I also want to acknowledge, give an acknowledgement of country. I'm sitting here in Melbourne. We're on the unceded, i.e. the lands of the Wurundjeri people that were not given over to white settlers and the Kulin nations. And that brings me on to just mentioning, of course, the fact that in Australia, we've recently had the constitutional amendment referendum campaign over what was called the Voice to Parliament. Australia is a really interesting country for voting purposes for other members of the Commonwealth and for other countries around the world. Mandatory voting, 90% turnout is normal in Australian elections. That may seem extraordinary to people in other parts of the world. And in order for this referendum to pass, it had to have a majority in 4 out of the 6 states. It didn't actually achieve a majority anywhere at all. Victoria, where I live in Melbourne, was closest to a majority. It was 55-45 against. I'm not going to talk about it in terms of the disinformation environment, although that's what I'm about to talk to you as a case study, partly because this was a big media campaign. So this was a campaign with some AI-generated deep fakes and some AI-generated information, but for the most part, it was newspaper, television, door knocking, posters, the traditional way that we think of campaigning in an analog environment. So let's just do the mandatory couple of slides about gee whiz, isn't AI amazing? And so here is why AI is somewhat amazing. It's the brute force of the power of systems, really, which has enabled us to move towards some reading comprehension, language understanding, image recognition, the things that we now understand over the last year since ChatGPT was launched just under a year ago, of course. And that's how we got the lovely picture of Nina that she generated herself. I should say I'm going to somewhat bury artificial intelligence in this talk, and I do agree very largely with what everything that Maria Louisa spoke about. So I'm not going to go over that ground too much. But just to say, I do recognise artificial intelligence has made enormous breakthroughs in areas like healthcare. And last week I was at the Victorian Heart Institute and talking about these things, although also talking about the fact that chatbots are dangerous in healthcare just as they are in democracy. So we recognize, I think, as a group that AI is a networked resource. It sits on top of a lot of other apps. I'm not going to give you the story about the gold mine and people making money selling shovels, but nevertheless, companies like NVIDIA, companies like Amazon Web Services, companies like Google and Microsoft who provide cloud services and computing and storage have, of course, huge interests in what everyone else does on top of that. With apps and so on. And here are some examples of some of the generative AI companies that exist. As we know, chatbots have been around for a while. I think it's obligatory to put the slide of Clippy on. Microsoft, of course, is back with their huge investment in OpenAI, amongst other things. And we are maybe achieving AI-powered search at this point. People remember 20 years ago, ask Jeeves. You can now actually ask Jeeves, and Jeeves may at least give the illusion of sentience, as well as the illusion of factual accuracy. So I'm going to talk about disinformation in particular, partly because it's what politicians are most concerned about. It's their jobs, after all, and partly because it's an area where I've done a huge amount of research. So we're worried about fake speech and hate speech. Much of it's spread by bots online, their impact on fair elections and civil society, and therefore parliaments. But the concerns which were encapsulated in the BAFTA-winning, the award-winning film, The Great Hack, are much older. And they go back, I know it's very early morning in the Caribbean, but the 2010 Trinidad elections, if anyone's online from the Caribbean, the Ukraine 2011 elections. And Europe had led the way in willingness to legislate about this, much as they did with privacy, of course, with the GDPR. But it wasn't the European Commission that started. It was Germany with the NetzDG law in 2017. France also had a law legislating against disinformation. And I'll talk about these a little bit. Okay, so specifics. I'm going to go through this fairly. Everyone knows this, I hope. The European Commission, a high-level expert group, explained the difference between disinformation and misinformation and how those work. Of course, if you post misinformation and then don't correct it when you've been had fact check carried out on you, you're then actually promoting disinformation. But there is at least initially a difference between dis and misinformation. Disinformation is a very rapidly moving target. We conducted a study, I'll explain the team, that worked on this for the European Parliament, looking even 5 years ago at many, many papers and articles and reports. And this, I'll explain, was about the evidence of harm from artificial intelligence generated disinformation and artificial intelligence generated attempts to stop disinformation. And of course, in 2018, we were at that point most concerned about the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the Brexit referendum in the UK. And it's worth saying the report that we wrote for the European Commission was pre the Mueller report in the US and pre some of what happened in the UK. So this is what the report was: platform values in democratic elections. How can the law regulate digital disinformation? And there's an academic article there to accompany it. This is my colleague, political scientist Tricia Meyer from the Free University of Brussels, who worked on this with me, and also Ian Brown was our expert advisor, who's a computer scientist, also an expert on privacy and on areas to do with interoperability of digital systems and AI systems. So the report was about whether or not artificial intelligence, the arms race between disinformation and the regulation of disinformation using artificial intelligence, was arriving at something useful for us. And we presented this report in Strasbourg as a much quieter European Parliament than that picture indicates. It was 2 days actually after a terrorist attack in the Christmas market in Strasbourg. And we presented our report, and I'll explain the results probably right at the end. And it's an interdisciplinary study because you have to have people from different disciplines working on these things. And I'm sure all of your own parliaments are looking at AI from the point of view of the law, the politics, and of course the technology, amongst other things, sociology, anthropology, and other disciplines. We looked at Cambridge Analytica, which was the company, of course, behind some of the great hack study that we talked about. The many actors involved in hacking elections. Russia's the bogeyman, but of course there were many domestic and overseas actors active in lots of different places. And there's a short video there that I've got the link to. I'll post these slides online that will give you a 3-minute synopsis rather than having to use a 100-page report, although the regulatory annex of the report is really worth looking at. And there's one thing that's inaccurate in the video, which is that I suggested somehow you get a trained Indian lawyer for a small amount of money, which if it was ever true, it certainly isn't true anymore. It's also worth saying, since that report came out in 2019, when it was finally published by the European Parliament, there have been some regulatory cases under the Brexit referendum. I won't talk in detail about them, but there were cases involving the Leave EU campaign that was the shadow campaign, the startup campaign, if you like. Okay, we also conducted a study, and again, this is myself and Ian Brown, but also with James Lee and Michael Veal for the Commonwealth on cybersecurity and disinformation. So it's focused on cybersecurity. The electoral commissions we dealt with, and I should say that I want to thank again, the majority of the electoral commissions of the Commonwealth filled out actually a very long study that we gave them in order to look at this. And so we produced a good practice guide, which was published in March of 2020, right before the pandemic. And we actually conducted some workshops in Sydney for the Pacific Islands, in Johannesburg for the African members, and also in the Caribbean as well, where frankly we learned a lot more from the electoral commissions than we were perhaps training. It was much more receiving than broadcasting. And this is the launch. I won't go over it in detail. Just 3rd of March 2020, which is an odd time to launch, but nevertheless it's out there. And we made some suggestions. Now, did the Commonwealth act on these recommendations for cybersecurity expertise? Well, to some extent. And there's a really interesting case study here. If my host will forgive me for just mentioning this very briefly. The Kenya election was declared on the 16th of August 2022. It was very controversial, partly because of registration using biometrics and partly because of the fact that that program had to be suspended. There was a lack of resources, there was a lack of coordination, and there were these official observers. Now, the actual official report on that election observation mission came out 2 months ago, and it had some official guidelines, but it also had this, a recommendation that of the Communications Act of 2018, sections 22 and 23 be repealed because they offended against freedom of expression in the way that they regulated disinformation. And there's a real concerns there. And there's a real problem actually with the report itself, which oddly, I always read the footnotes, I'm a lawyer by training, oddly suggested 20% of Kenyan citizens use social media, which is just nonsense. I'm not quite sure why that was written. There's a much more up-to-date report by Freedom, I say much more up-to-date, a much more contemporary sourced report by Freedom House about the problems of social media and disinformation in the election. But also it's worth noting that in Kenya, actually, most people are online. Of those, 90% use social media of various types, and you can see the statistics actually from the same source as the report itself. And about 40 million people use social media. Disinformation is a very real problem in elections, including in Kenya. Okay, so let me just wrap up in 2 minutes. Just to say, of course, Kenya's got other problems, economic and others. And it's also worth saying Kenya, of course, supplies a huge workforce that's helping, as humans, to clean up some of the messiness of the AI models which exist out there. And there's lots of research that's been done into that, more research needed, how the global south is solving the global north's mess over the way in which we're using large language models. So here's the pyramid you might be familiar with, the co-regulatory triangle, laws at the top, standards, self-regulation and voluntary compliance. What's the sweet spot? Well, there isn't one necessarily. The European Union, as Maria Louisa said, has been very active, partly because I must tell you, the European Commissioner who's in charge of the disinformation agenda, she was in Prague in 1968 when Soviet Russian tanks rolled in to crush the democratic Prague Spring. So do not underestimate the personal commitment of the European Commissioner to this agenda. We made 5 recommendations. Some of them are obvious, some of them perhaps less so. First of all, media literacy is, of course, the first port of call, but this is a pressing and urgent problem, but user choice over information would help a lot. Strong human review and appeal processes where AI is used to remove content. This is really important. We may get into a discussion with Maria Luisa. Independent appeal and order to platforms so that you can see what's going on. Standardizing notice and appeal procedures across platforms so that you can actually ensure that users actually know what they're doing. And transparency in the techniques used to combat disinformation using AI. Right, so 2 things about that. The first is, I'll probably leave this slide up at the end. There are lots of ways of doing it, co-regulation, self-regulation, but different types that exist within that. And maybe just one final point before I wrap up, which is that we made lots of recommendations for government again in 2021. This was a chapter that I wrote with Ian Brown and Michael Veal, explaining some of the problems. And one of the biggest problems is electoral commissions and indeed governments shutting down the internet during elections and during counts. And we suggest that avoiding that is really important as much as possible. We didn't necessarily expect that this actually became a problem in the United States with Donald Trump denial of the election result in 2020, but really huge issue. So let me leave maybe that slide up and turn it over. Maybe I should stop sharing at this point and turn it over to our host again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Yes, the screen sharing has now gone. You kept very well to time, so we have about 2 minutes before the end. As I mentioned, I would encourage participants to put any questions in the chat or comments before we wrap up. And we do have some
Margot Oliver. And I do have a reply to that, although it's for Maria Luisa, and it's that we need the Commonwealth to help us to, particularly smaller countries, to achieve codes of conduct, codes of practice with the big platforms. But Maria Luisa, the question's aimed at you, so I'll shut up.
Well, we can bring both, and I'll try and give a more succinct response to the question, which was directed at you, Maria Luisa, and Ago Oliver Bemenju asks, it's about, you mentioned that platforms in the US has rights different from those in Europe, and they mentioned the US Cloud Act, which gives the US more power over other continents, except for decisions from the European Court. And then they also mentioned Africa, the continent of Africa, being at a disadvantage, given that all the tech firms are often outside in the West or mostly in the US, and maybe then some advice to maybe legislators or policymakers in these jurisdictions on legislation or regulation which could assist these countries that perhaps a bit further behind. So Maria, I can open up that to you, but Chris, feel free to jump in as well.
Thank you. Well, indeed, thanks for this excellent question. I think is the crucial point. So I see two main layers where the risks can be. Well, let's put it this way: there are at least 2 things to unpack when we talk about this. The first one is that. We've discussed the Digital Services Act, and I've mentioned that the European Commission is quite strong in its attempt to, make it known, let's say in a mild way, make it known to other jurisdictions and try to support the DSA as a proper learning experience, if not one of, the positive attempts to find a regulatory framework for these problems. In Africa, especially, I'm also aware about the fact that the European Commission is trying to do the same with the Digital Markets Act, which rather than looking at the specific possibilities to regulate how the digital services are offered on the market, it looks at the gatekeeping position of a number of big tech, and it sort of tries to open up the markets and make them more fair for the businesses and for the end users, the consumers, or the people, as we want to define them. I've seen that there have been already plenty of discussions in different African countries about how to sort of endorse the DMA or make it happen also in African countries. And I would say that it is super important that, in a way, I talk about civil society because this is the kind of stakeholder I pertain to, but also researchers as well, independent researchers. I think it's important that these two categories, they try to raise the attention that on the fact that a simple copy-paste exercise is never going to work. Is possibly going to create more damages than advantages. And although I do believe, and I'm obviously convinced that we're talking about global companies, and we can't reasonably ask these global companies to adopt different business models and to provide services in a different way in each and every jurisdiction they operate. And I'm not even sure this will be at the benefit of people. On the other side, we need to demand some flexibility because depending on the economic, political, social context that where these services are offered and where these companies operate, we will get to a completely different outcome. So another one possibility is every time there is a multi-stakeholder global initiative, I would say the civil society and the researchers again, but also possibly the governments, they need to raise the attention on the fact that their voice needs to be listened to as well. It's not all about creating an environment that is profitable for external companies to come and invest. This can be a very short-term and short-sighted policy. I would say in these cases, it's essential to attribute some adjectives to innovation and development. It must be sustainable. It must be for the people. It cannot be just an open door to extraction, to say it in a very simple way. The second element is I do believe that in each and every case, when we talk about governance of AI or regulatory framework, we sort of assume that we have a rule of law system, and we sort of assume that we have regulators that are independent and accountable. And I am very well aware that this is not always the case. And so I do believe that the two exercises, they need to go in parallel. To have a proper regulatory framework for AI or proper governance model, we need independent and accountable players in this system. So pushing for the rule of law, it's also a way to push for a better AI governance system in the medium and long term.
Thank you, Maria Luisa. And Chris, if you wanted to come in, any additional thoughts or final thoughts before we wrap up?
I wrote something in the Q&A, and also someone just asked, shouldn't the advertisers be made to be much more responsible? And I would very much agree and say we've moved beyond self-regulation. I think that we can generally agree on that. We need to maintain freedom of expression, but we do need to actually regulate companies to ensure that they're responsible, but with appeal and with the constitutional guarantee of freedom of expression attached to it, which is unbelievably difficult, and which is where Maria Luisa and I could talk for several hours more about the problems that engenders. But we must always remember that freedom of expression has to be alongside these kinds of laws. You can't just have a disinformation law where government says this is disinformation, we're banning it. That would be the worst type of disinformation censorship. So it's really tricky. And I appreciate national context is really important. And I really appreciate you hosting the discussion, because I think that honestly, this is something that countries, electoral commissions, but also parliaments are crying out for some kind of best practice model law in how to do this. Because left to their own devices, individual countries find it very, very hard to negotiate with the giant platforms. And the giant platforms will show you 1 billion bots have been deleted and say, look, there we are, we've deleted 1 billion bots. Aren't we wonderful? And that's like, you have everyone's always owned this cat that just leaves lots of dead birds on your doorstep. That isn't exactly the way that you maintain freedom of expression and democracy. You need to have much more robust appeal procedures built into it. So that's my long way of saying I was going to just say yes.
Thank you, Chris. We have run slightly over time, so it's a shame to sort of cut this discussion short, but I think it was a lot of information in both presentations. And again, to all attendees, we'll be very happy to share with Chris's permission as well, his presentation, and also some of the additional resources that Chris shared and that Chris himself was involved in. I think the recommendations, cybersecurity for Commonwealth elections, is very timely given some of the number of big elections within the Commonwealth and beyond coming up next year in particular. So big thanks again to Maria Louisa and a big thanks to Chris. I think it's added another almost complicating dimension to this issue of AI, disinformation, and what Parliament can do. I think many of the solutions out there and the regulation and the different actors that have a responsibility for regulation and how they interact adds another complicating but important dimension to the harms of disinformation and other effects of AI alone. So much food for thought. That does wrap us up for the day. And again, big thanks to both our panelists before we leave. We have our final day of conference tomorrow, which starts at 11 a.m. GMT London time, but please do check your relevant time zones. And in day 3, we'll be building on the themes of day 1 and day 2. And we're going into a bit more detail into individual protections. So looking in more detail at the threats to individuals, particularly parliamentarians, and issues on reputational threats, for example, as well as looking at different thematic issues from a gender lens and also human rights. So we do encourage you all to please join and register if you haven't registered for day 3 tomorrow. But with that said, that does bring us towards a close. For those that were here this morning and yesterday, we do one final poll at the end of each day. So my colleague, I think, will put the poll up now, which shouldn't take more than 10-30 seconds or so. So we would encourage you all to just answer the poll very quickly.